It started as a trip I had been planning for months, a chance to escape the endless noise of the city, the constant flicker of screens, and the suffocating routine that seemed to shape every hour of my life. I found a small cabin online, nestled deep in a forest miles away from the nearest town, accessible only by a long, winding dirt road that was barely visible on the map. It promised solitude, fresh air, and the chance to disconnect completely. At the time, I wanted nothing more than that. The drive out there was long, almost 6 hours from the city. At first, the road was lined with familiar sights, fading towns, occasional gas stations, the sound of tires on asphalt. But as I drove further, the landscape began to change. Trees grew taller and closer together, their branches stretching over the road and creating long, dark shadows that moved with the wind. The sky was heavy with clouds that threatened rain, and the air grew cooler as I drove deeper into the forest. My car rattled over the uneven dirt path, the occasional pothole jolting me awake from the relaxed daze I had slipped into. Every few miles, the trees would part just enough to reveal a small clearing or an abandoned cabin, long decayed, leaning at impossible angles, with windows shattered and doors hanging on rusted hinges. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, but I told myself it was just part of the charm, part of the isolation I had come here for. By the time I reached the cabin I had rented, it was late afternoon, the kind of light that falls softly over the treetops, neither bright nor fully dark. The cabin was small, one story, built of rough-hewn logs with a tin roof that had rusted in streaks. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, the faint scent of wood and moss clinging to it. A narrow dirt path led from the main road to the front porch, and I parked my car at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The cabin itself was simple inside. A single room with a small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, a sink, a few pots and pans, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed against the far wall. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked, and the windows rattled slightly from the wind outside. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something else I couldn't place at first, an earthy, almost metallic scent that seemed to settle in the corners of the room. I spent the first hour unpacking my bag, arranging my few supplies, and making a small fire in the stove. The flicker of flames cast warm shadows across the room, softening the harsh angles of the logs and giving the space a sense of comfort I hadn't felt in months. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a low, constant whisper that seemed to brush against the windows. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I felt a thrill at being completely alone. No one to check in on me, no one to demand anything from me, no one to notice if I stayed in bed all day. As night fell, the cabin seemed to shrink around me. Shadows deepened in the corners, stretching along the walls, and the sounds outside grew louder. Not just the wind, but the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of some nocturnal animal. My fire was low now, the warmth fading, and I realized how cold it was getting. I bundled myself in blankets and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet my thoughts. It was then that I noticed the first oddity. A sound, faint at first, like someone walking outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear, telling myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, perhaps, or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, a deliberate crunch of leaves underfoot, moving slowly, circling the cabin. My pulse quickened. I checked the windows. They were shut tight. There was no one in sight, nothing but the dark forest. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that the wind had shifted branches or that my mind was playing tricks in the silence. I went to the front door and checked the lock. Secure. I went to the back door. Also locked. I even checked the small windows near the kitchen. All tight. But the sound persisted. It was methodical, not random, as if someone or something was deliberately moving around the cabin, just out of sight. I could hear the slight scrape of shoes or boots against the dirt path, the soft crack of twigs snapping. I decided to stay put, reasoning that if someone was out there, I was safest inside. I kept the fire going, stacking more wood to ensure it wouldn't die down, and grabbed a heavy kitchen knife from the drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, the knife clutched in my hand. Hours passed, the sound coming and going in irregular bursts. Sometimes I could hear it move around the front of the cabin, sometimes around the back. Each time, my heart jumped into my throat. The cold seeped in, the blankets no longer providing comfort, and my mind spun worst-case scenarios that made me sweat even in the chill. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the window. A shadow flitted between the trees, pale in the moonlight. I held my breath, staring, but when I blinked, it was gone. I tried to convince myself again it was a deer or a raccoon, but the deliberate circling, the timing of the noises, it didn't feel natural. It felt like someone was testing me, probing the cabin, waiting to see if I would leave or make a mistake. Sleep was impossible. I dozed intermittently, startled awake by every creak and rustle. At some point, I realized I had been gripping the knife so tightly my hand hurt, knuckles white. I forced myself to relax, to remind myself I was inside, I was safe, and I had locked the doors. But my mind kept spinning, imagining every possible scenario. Someone could be hiding in the trees, watching, waiting. Someone could be lying in wait on the road, planning to strike. Morning brought no relief. The sound from the night was gone, but the tension remained. I stepped outside to assess the surroundings. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick, and there were faint footprints circling the cabin. Heavy, booted prints, unmistakably human. My stomach turned. I photographed them on my phone, my hands shaking, trying to remember every detail. They were large, deliberate, and they hadn't been there when I arrived. Whoever had been out there had stayed all night, circling the cabin without leaving any other trace. The thought made me feel violated, exposed. I spent the next day cautiously inspecting the cabin, checking locks, reinforcing weak points with chairs and furniture, and trying to devise a plan in case whoever had been out there returned. I knew the nearest town was miles away, and cell reception was weak at best. If I needed help, it could take hours. I decided to ration my energy, keep a low profile, and wait for night to fall again, hoping whoever had been there would move on. That second night was worse. The sounds returned almost immediately after sunset. The deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin, closer this time. I could hear them on the porch, testing the door, the soft scrape of something against the wooden siding. I stayed in the corner, watching the shadows, the knife ready, my heart pounding so hard I was certain they could hear it. Hours dragged by. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every sound was amplified, every movement suspicious. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped abruptly. I held my breath, waiting, my eyes fixed on the windows. And then came the scratching. Not the rustle of leaves or a branch, but a sharp, deliberate scratching against the door, like nails scraping wood. I could see the marks forming, faint but unmistakable. Panic surged. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the authorities, but there was no signal. No one could hear me. I was utterly alone. Time blurred after that. I don't know how long I stayed crouched in the corner, listening to the scratching that never seemed to end, broken only by moments of silence that felt worse than the noise. My body ached, my mind raced. I considered trying to escape, but stepping outside meant exposing myself to whoever or whatever was out there. The windows were my only connection to the outside, and every glance made me jump. Dawn finally arrived, pale and gray, bleeding through the treetops. The scratching had stopped. The footsteps were gone. I waited until the sun had risen high enough to shine directly on the clearing before I dared to move. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was disturbed in multiple places. Footprints, definitely human, leading around the cabin and disappearing into the forest. I followed them a short distance, documenting everything, but they stopped abruptly, as if whoever had been there had vanished into thin air. I spent the next day leaving. I packed quickly, checked every lock, and kept my eyes on the forest as I drove. I didn't stop to look back, even when I passed familiar clearings or abandoned cabins. The experience left me shaken, exhausted, and hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. I didn't return to that area for years, and when I finally did, the cabin was gone, replaced by a cleared plot of land, overgrown but empty, leaving only the memory of that terrifying solitude. Even now, years later, I think about those nights often. About the footsteps, the scratching, the deliberate, methodical presence outside my cabin. I never saw anyone, never knew who or why they were there. But the fear was real, the danger was real, and the isolation magnified every detail. I learned that night that being alone in the wilderness doesn't just bring peace. It also brings vulnerability, and sometimes you are not as safe as you think. The experience changed how I think about isolation and survival. Now, whenever I go into the woods, I prepare for the worst. I check locks, I assess the terrain, I never underestimate the quiet or the darkness. The forest is beautiful, and the cabin was perfect for solitude, but it also taught me a hard lesson about the fine line between adventure and danger. I survived, and I survived by being cautious, by respecting the unknown, and by never letting myself believe I was untouchable. That knowledge stayed with me, haunting, shaping every future trip, every choice, every step I take in the wild. I can no longer see a cabin in the woods and think only of peace. I see potential, yes, but also the shadow of human threat, the reminder that isolation is only as safe as your vigilance allows. I had been driving for hours, the winding forest roads stretching ahead like thin ribbons of asphalt through a sea of towering pine and spruce. The day had been hot, and the car's air conditioning was barely keeping up. My destination was a small, remote cabin I had rented for a week, somewhere far away from the city and its constant noise. I needed this break, needed the silence, the isolation. My life had been chaotic for months, with work stress, family pressures, and the constant hum of my phone keeping me tethered to the world. This cabin promised freedom from all of that, a place where I could be completely alone with my thoughts, my own breathing, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The directions to the cabin had been clear enough on the website, but once I turned off the main road, the pavement became rough and uneven, patches of dirt and loose stones jostling the car. The forest seemed to close in on both sides, thick trunks and heavy underbrush pressing toward the road, making the sky above feel narrower and the world smaller. I passed a few small signs pointing in the general direction, nothing precise, and eventually I reached a gate, old and rusted, with a sign that read the cabin's name. Beyond it, the road became even rougher, a narrow track barely wide enough for the car. I drove slowly, knowing that any mistake could send me sliding into a ditch or worse, into the dense forest on either side. When I finally caught sight of the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. A modest wooden structure, 2 stories, with a small porch and a chimney that suggested a fireplace inside. Smoke was curling lazily into the sky, and I felt a small sense of comfort, imagining the warmth of a fire after the long drive. The forest around it was dense, the trees close enough that the sunlight barely reached the ground, and the air smelled of pine, damp soil, and something faintly metallic like iron or wet leaves. I parked the car, taking a moment to breathe in the quiet. No cars, no people, no distant hum of electricity, just the sound of the wind and the occasional bird call. The cabin was silent, empty, and still, except for the faint creak of the roof as it settled. The door opened easily with the key the owner had provided. Inside, the cabin was rustic but clean, the furniture simple and practical. There was a small kitchen, a dining area, and a living room with a stone fireplace. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It felt safe, solid, a place built to last in the middle of the wilderness. I unpacked quickly, not wanting to waste daylight, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and I felt a wave of relief as the warmth began to spread. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the trees and shaking loose small branches that fell with sharp cracks onto the ground. It was a perfect place to be alone, to escape, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the forest seemed to close in around the cabin. The sense of isolation, which had felt comforting before, now carried a faint edge of unease. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. The bed was firm but comfortable, and I lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind outside, the occasional snap of a branch, and the distant rustle of leaves. Somewhere in the forest, I thought I heard something larger moving, a sound of heavy steps through dry leaves and underbrush. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a bear, and eventually drifted off, though sleep came fitfully. I woke the next morning to a strange stillness. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed eerily quiet. Even the birds were absent. I dressed quickly and went outside, hoping to stretch my legs and maybe follow a small trail I had noticed the day before. The ground was damp from overnight dew, and my boots sank slightly into the soft soil. As I walked, I kept an eye out for animal tracks. There were some, but nothing alarming. I felt a growing sense of relief at the normalcy, but the quiet was almost oppressive, as if the forest was holding its breath. That afternoon, I went to explore further, following a narrow path that led deeper into the trees. It was a challenging walk, the underbrush thick, roots snaking across the trail, and low-hanging branches scratching at my clothes. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing, a patch of sunlight breaking through the dense canopy, illuminating a shallow stream. I knelt by the water, drinking from my bottle and watching small fish dart beneath the surface. The peace was profound, almost intoxicating, but it didn't last. When I turned to head back, I realized I had lost the trail. Every tree looked the same, the forest uniform and endless. Panic started to creep in, a knot in my stomach tightening as I tried to remember which way I had come. I backtracked slowly, marking my path with small pieces of broken branches, hoping to find the trail, but after what felt like hours, I was more lost than ever. The sun was beginning to dip again when I finally spotted a familiar landmark, the cabin's roof through the trees. Relief washed over me so strongly that I almost stumbled in my haste to return. But as I neared the cabin, I noticed something unusual. There were footprints around the cabin, heavy and deep, different from mine, leading toward the forest and back again. They were large, the kind of prints a man might leave if he were wearing heavy boots, and they hadn't been there the day before. My pulse quickened, a chill running down my back. I told myself someone could have been hunting nearby, or maybe another cabin renter had come, but the road was far and isolated. No one should have been here. I checked the locks, secured the doors, and spent the night in a heightened state of alertness. Every sound, the wind, the branches, the occasional distant animal call, made me tense. I kept a fire burning, not just for warmth, but for a sense of security. Sleep was shallow, broken by the smallest noises. I kept imagining someone out there, watching, waiting, though I knew rationally it was unlikely. Still, the footprints had been real, and the forest was too quiet to be normal. The next day, I decided to be proactive. I took my car and drove the rough road back toward the main road, looking for any sign of another cabin or a person. The road was empty, no other cars, no signs of life, and I returned later with nothing learned. I felt frustrated, the isolation turning from peaceful to oppressive, the cabin no longer a refuge but a trap. That night, the wind was stronger, rattling the cabin windows, and I barely slept. I could hear faint noises outside, something brushing against the trees, something too heavy to be just a deer. On the third day, I decided I needed to understand what was happening. I inspected the cabin thoroughly, looking for signs of forced entry, traps, anything that could explain the footprints and the noises. There was nothing, everything was normal. But then I noticed something subtle. The back door, the one leading to the small deck, was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. My stomach sank. Someone had been here. The thought made my skin crawl. I realized that whoever it was, they had been careful, leaving no signs except the footprints and the slightly moved door. I began taking precautions. I barricaded the doors with furniture, kept a heavy lamp nearby, and kept my phone fully charged in case I needed to call for help. That night, the fear reached a new level. I stayed awake until exhaustion forced me to lie down, but every noise made me flinch. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering. The steps paused near the door, then continued, moving around the cabin's perimeter. I could hear them on the deck, the wooden boards creaking under weight. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then there was silence. I didn't dare look outside, didn't dare move. Hours passed. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the windows. The steps were gone, but the sense of being watched remained. In the morning, I made a decision. I packed only what I could carry, took my keys, and prepared to leave. I checked the car carefully, nothing out of place, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin through the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the tree-line, a shadow slipping between the trees. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I didn't stop. I kept driving until the trees thinned and the pavement became smooth again. When I finally reached a gas station, I called the local authorities and reported the incidents. They listened, skeptical but professional. They said the area was known for occasional trespassers, and while they would send someone to check, it was unlikely anything serious would be found. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had indeed been broken into multiple times over the years, by people looking for isolation or a place to hide for short periods. No one had been caught. I never returned. The cabin, once a promise of peace, had become a reminder of how quickly solitude could turn into danger. I realized that even in the quietest, most remote places, there are risks, and sometimes the only safe action is to leave before curiosity or stubbornness puts you in real danger. I had escaped without harm, and I was grateful, but the memory of the footsteps, the door slightly ajar, and the silent shadow in the forest stayed with me for a long time. The fear I had felt was raw and real, and it reminded me that survival isn't about bravery. It's about awareness, caution, and knowing when to walk away. The experience changed the way I approach solitude. I became more careful, more aware of my surroundings, and I no longer romanticized the idea of being completely alone. The cabin, the forest, the isolation, they were beautiful and serene in daylight, but they had a side I had not anticipated, a side that could have turned deadly if I had hesitated even once. I learned that fear is not just in your mind. It's a signal, a warning that you need to respect, and sometimes listening to it is the only way to make it through unharmed. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of escaping the city for a week, locking myself away in a cabin deep in the woods, had felt like the perfect solution to the constant noise and pressure of my life. I wanted solitude, quiet, and a chance to clear my head without anyone intruding. The cabin was old but sturdy, nestled beside a small, murky lake that reflected the tall pine trees that surrounded it. The road leading there was barely a trail, winding and narrow, lined with underbrush and fallen leaves. I had driven for hours on it, listening to nothing but the crunch of tires over gravel and the occasional bird call. The city, with its horns, sirens, and relentless chatter, had already begun to feel like a different world behind me. The first day was uneventful, the way I had hoped it would be. I unpacked slowly, arranging my few belongings neatly in the cabin. The wood smelled faintly of pine, but there was a sharp tang to it as well, something like damp earth and mildew that reminded me the cabin had been empty for a while. I cleaned the counters, wiped the floors, and inspected the fireplace. The cabin had basic electricity, but no Wi-Fi, which I had promised myself would help me disconnect entirely. I made a small fire in the fireplace that evening, the crackle of the flames filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning wood. I made a simple dinner, then settled into the old armchair near the window. Outside, the lake was a mirror, the trees standing tall and black against the fading light. Night fell slowly, and I stayed awake for a while, staring at the dark water and listening to the forest. There was no wind, yet the leaves rustled softly, as if whispering to each other. Somewhere far off, an owl called out, and the sound carried over the still water. I felt calm at first, the kind of calm that comes from knowing no one can bother you and nothing can hurt you. But as the night deepened, I realized how completely isolated I was. No other lights anywhere, no roads nearby, no sounds of cars or people, just the distant call of animals and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen weight. It was the kind of silence that could be comforting, but also unnerving, because you suddenly noticed every small sound, every shadow, every shift in the wind or movement of leaves. The second day I spent exploring the area around the cabin. There was a faint path leading along the lake, and I followed it, noting the way the ground sloped unevenly toward the water. The trees were dense, the kind that allowed little sunlight to reach the forest floor. I walked for hours, noticing broken branches and small trails where animals had passed. Occasionally, I spotted deer or a fox slipping through the undergrowth, but nothing larger, nothing that made me worry at that point. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, feeling pleasantly tired, and built another fire in the fireplace. The cabin felt warmer now, more lived in, though I kept the doors locked and the windows latched tightly, a habit I had learned from years of city life that made me wary of strangers. That night, as I lay in the bed, I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, rattling sound against the cabin walls. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate snap, like a branch breaking under a heavy footstep. I froze, straining my ears. The sound didn't come from the road or from the lakeside. It was right outside the cabin, moving slowly around the perimeter. My heart began to race. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too precise, too measured for a wild animal. I lay still for hours, listening to the occasional movement outside. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it, the tension of isolation playing tricks on my mind, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I found evidence that made my blood run cold. Footprints. There were prints in the soft mud near the cabin, human prints, booted, moving in a circle around the cabin as if someone had been watching it overnight. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been out there had left carefully. No other sign of disturbance. Just these prints and the knowledge that I had not been alone. I checked the doors and windows, all locked as before. Nothing had been moved inside. Yet the footprints were undeniable, and they made me realize the cabin wasn't as isolated as I had thought. Someone had been there, someone watching. I considered leaving immediately, but I had driven so far, and the road back was long and treacherous. I thought if I stayed vigilant, nothing could happen. I reinforced the locks, dragged heavy furniture near the windows, and kept the fireplace ready to light at any moment. All day, I stayed near the cabin, peering out from behind the curtains whenever I heard a sound. The day passed slowly, my nerves stretched taut, and when night came again, I barely slept. The sounds outside were more distinct now, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, the crunch of leaves, the occasional tapping against the window. Every time I moved, the noises would stop. The third day, I decided to take more extreme measures. I walked around the cabin, scouting the immediate area, making sure there were no hiding spots too close to the structure. I carried a long, heavy branch, ready in case of confrontation. I noticed more tracks, some from small animals, some clearly human. Whoever had been there wasn't just passing through. They had been circling the cabin repeatedly, watching, waiting. I found remnants of a campfire a few hundred yards away, ashes and small bits of burned wood. I knew then that someone had stayed there, observing me. It was unnerving. The idea that someone could be so close and so hidden, just watching, making no move yet. By the fourth day, my paranoia had taken a hold. I checked every corner of the cabin, every window, every door, even the attic space I hadn't considered before. I kept the fireplace burning constantly now, the light throwing shadows across the room, and I slept in short bursts, never fully allowing myself to relax. Every sound outside, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. I started thinking about the worst-case scenarios. Someone breaking in, someone waiting for the right moment, someone with intentions I could not predict. I stocked the kitchen knives, set up chairs against the doors as barricades, and kept the branch close at all times. On the fifth day, the situation escalated. I saw him, or at least I assumed it was a man. From a distance across the lake, I noticed movement among the trees. A figure, thin and tall, partially obscured, watching the cabin. My first instinct was disbelief, thinking it was a trick of the light, a shadow, or a deer standing upright in some unnatural way. But then he moved again, and I saw clearly a human figure, wearing dark clothes, standing still and staring in my direction. I grabbed my phone, only to realize there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and any chance of calling for help was gone. My stomach turned to ice. The next hours were a blur of preparation. I barricaded the cabin doors as best I could, moved heavy furniture in front of them, and kept all the knives and tools within reach. I stayed near the windows, watching every tree line, every shadow. The figure remained distant but persistent, never moving closer during the day, but always there, as if marking time until nightfall. I kept thinking about what he could want, what he had been doing all this time, and how long he had been there before I even noticed. Night came again, and it was worse than before. The sounds outside were precise, methodical. Someone was moving around, scraping, tapping, testing, making sure I knew they were there. I stayed low, clutching the branch, and for hours I barely dared breathe. Then came the unmistakable sound, the scraping of a tool against wood, someone trying the locks. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but I had planned for this. I had reinforced the doors with extra boards, placed the furniture strategically. Whoever was outside was persistent, but they could not get in. At dawn, I surveyed the perimeter. There were new marks, deeper scratches in the wood of the cabin, footprints all around the doors and windows. He had spent the night attempting to enter, or at least to intimidate me. I realized then that staying in the cabin, alone, was not safe anymore. I needed a plan, a way out. I spent the entire next day preparing. I gathered supplies, packed essential items in a backpack, and mapped the quickest way back to the main road. I studied the forest carefully, noting hidden paths, natural cover, and possible escape routes. I decided I would leave at night under cover of darkness, when he might assume I was asleep or too exhausted to move. I would move quietly, quickly, and avoid open spaces as much as possible. That night, I waited until I was certain he was on the opposite side of the cabin. I slipped out, backpack on my shoulders, branch in hand, moving silently through the trees. My pulse was deafening, my ears strained for every sound. I kept to the shadows, avoiding the trail, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the occasional snapping of a branch, but nothing that indicated he had noticed. I ran when I could, crouched when I needed, and stayed alert every second. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road. It was deserted, but the gravel under my shoes felt like a solid promise of safety. I walked for miles until I finally spotted a car, and after waving frantically, I was able to get a ride to the nearest town. I called the authorities, who returned with officers to inspect the cabin. They found the tracks, the marks on the doors, the remnants of his observation points in the woods. But he was gone, vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but his presence behind. I never returned to that cabin. I never wanted to see it again. The memory of the footsteps circling outside, the figure across the lake, and the nights spent in terror remained with me for years. But I survived. I planned carefully, stayed alert, and made it out alive. The experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the fragility of safety, and the thin line between solitude and vulnerability. I learned that fear is not always imagined, and sometimes the threat is very real, waiting quietly until the moment it can act. And I learned, above all, that survival depends on careful thinking, preparation, and the will to keep moving forward, even when the world feels completely alone. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, from the noise and constant pressure, and find some quiet in the woods. The cabin was isolated, far from the nearest town, and only reachable by a long dirt road that wound through dense forests and over small hills. I packed my car with everything I thought I would need. Enough food for a week, firewood, a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a map, and a couple of blankets. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, only the chance to sit outside, breathe the forest air, and watch the stars at night. The drive itself was long and tiring. The sun was already low in the sky when I turned off the main road onto the dirt track that would take me to the cabin. The road narrowed quickly and the trees seemed to close in around it, their branches forming a kind of dark tunnel over the car. I drove slowly, trying not to hit the occasional potholes or rocks hidden in the dust. After about an hour, the trees finally parted and I saw the cabin in a small clearing. It was old but solid, made of rough wood, with a stone chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Around it were a few tall pine trees and a small clearing where I could see a fire pit and the remains of what looked like old picnic tables. It was beautiful and quiet, exactly what I had hoped for. I got out of the car and stretched. The air was colder than I had expected, even though it was late spring. I brought my things into the cabin and set them down. The inside was small but cozy, with one main room that had a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a table. There was a loft above with a bed and some storage. The floor creaked when I walked, and the windows were dusty, but the place was solid and safe. I started a fire in the stove, unpacked my food, and settled in for the first night. I had planned to eat, read for a while, and then sleep early to adjust to the quiet. First, everything felt peaceful. The fire crackled in the stove, the wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear birds settling in for the night. But as darkness fell, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. A branch scraping against the window, a sudden rustle outside, the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably just deer or raccoons, that the forest had its own rhythm, and there was nothing to worry about. I had told myself that dozens of times as I carried wood, checked the locks, and made sure the windows were closed. By the second day, I had explored the immediate area around the cabin. There was a small stream about 100 yards away, and a path that led deeper into the woods. I spent the morning walking along the stream, watching the water swirl around rocks, listening to the birds and insects. The sunlight made patterns on the ground through the trees, and I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in months. I collected some firewood along the path, noticing the forest was dense and quiet, but still alive with small movements. That night, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. While I was bringing wood into the cabin, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, near the edge of the clearing. It was quick, and I wasn't sure if it was an animal or just my imagination. But later, when I was cooking inside, I thought I heard footsteps on the dry leaves outside, slow and deliberate, not like a deer or a raccoon. I froze for a moment, listening. There was nothing after that, just the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I told myself the forest was alive. It was normal to hear things. I checked the locks again, closed all the windows, and tried to sleep. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I didn't want to take the long path into the woods again. Not yet. I spent the morning cleaning and organizing, stacking wood by the stove, making sure I had enough water, and preparing food. But all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, broken twigs outside, footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. But the more I noticed, the more tense I became. By the afternoon, I had noticed something I couldn't ignore. A set of footprints leading from the tree line to the cabin, fresh and large. They weren't deer tracks. They were too big, too flat, too deliberate. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, right where I had seen the shadow the night before. I spent the rest of that day watching the tree line. The sun was low, the shadows stretched across the clearing, and I felt exposed. I thought about leaving, driving back to the main road, but the dirt track was long, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to deal with the dark forest at night. I decided to stay inside and prepare the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture to block the doors, placed heavy objects near the windows, and kept a fire burning in the stove to provide some light. I made sure the flashlight was within reach and that I had a kitchen knife close by. Every sound outside made my heart jump. A bird landing on a branch, the wind in the leaves, even the creak of the cabin floor under my own feet. Everything felt magnified in the dark. That night, the footsteps started again. I heard them first on the path leading to the cabin, slow and heavy. They stopped, then moved along the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, listening, clutching the knife. The sound moved closer to the cabin, then stopped again. I could hear breathing, soft but audible, like someone was waiting. The fire in the stove made shadows dance across the walls, and I could see the outline of the window frames. Then suddenly, there was silence. It lasted for what felt like an hour, every second stretching endlessly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe more than necessary. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreating, moving back into the darkness of the forest. I waited until I was sure they were gone before letting myself breathe fully. The next day, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit inside and wait for whoever or whatever was out there. I decided to explore the surrounding area carefully, staying close to the cabin. I brought my backpack with water, the knife, a flashlight, and a heavy stick, just in case. As I moved through the woods, I noticed more evidence that I wasn't alone. More footprints, recently disturbed underbrush, and even a partially hidden campsite about a quarter mile from the cabin. It looked like someone had been watching the cabin, staying in the woods, moving in the shadows. I realized I couldn't just ignore it. Whoever it was, they were organized, patient, and knew the area. I spent the next few hours carefully tracking the signs, staying quiet and alert. The forest was silent in a way that made every sound stand out, and I moved slowly, almost crawling at times. I found scraps of food, pieces of torn clothing, and footprints that matched the ones near the cabin. It was clear that someone had been following me, observing me, maybe even waiting for me to be alone. I felt a cold sense of dread settle in my chest. This wasn't a random hiker or an animal. This was a human being, and they were dangerously close. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the stove, keeping the fire going, listening to the wind and every rustle outside. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch scraping against the cabin sounded like someone approaching. I checked the windows constantly, shining my flashlight across the clearing. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scraping sound at the back door, slow and deliberate. I held the knife tightly and waited. After a few moments, the sound stopped. I didn't move for hours, waiting, listening, terrified of what might happen if I looked. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I had to leave, get out of the woods, and get to safety. I packed quickly but carefully, keeping the knife in my hand and the flashlight ready. I tried to move quietly to avoid attracting attention. When I opened the door, I saw footprints leading away from the cabin, heading deeper into the woods. I realized whoever had been here last night was still around. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew panic would make me slow and make mistakes. I moved through the forest carefully, following the dirt track that led to the main road. Every sound made me tense, but I kept moving. About halfway through the track, I noticed fresh footprints alongside mine. Someone had followed me as I left. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep moving, keeping an eye on the trees on both sides. The sun was starting to rise, and I knew that if I could reach the main road, there would be cars and people. I had to survive until then. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the edge of the forest, the clearing where the dirt track met the main road. Relief washed over me. I ran the last few yards, waving my arms as a car approached. The driver stopped, and I jumped in without even thinking. I told them to drive, and they did, taking me away from the forest, away from the cabin, away from whoever had been following me. As we drove, I could see the cabin in the distance, quiet and still, and I felt a mixture of fear and relief. I had survived. I had escaped. Later, when I returned with the authorities, they found evidence of someone living secretly near the cabin. Makeshift shelters, more footprints, discarded food, and tools. They never found the person, but they confirmed my fears. It had been a human, someone who had been watching the cabin, waiting, and following anyone who came close. I never went back to that area. I never forgot the fear of being watched, of hearing footsteps at night, of feeling completely alone in the forest with someone nearby who meant harm. The experience left me shaken, but it also left me with a clear understanding. The woods are quiet, yes, but they are also unpredictable. People can hide in plain sight, and danger can come without warning. I learned to respect that, to prepare, and to always have a plan to leave. Even months later, I still sometimes dream about the sound of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, and I wake up drenched in sweat, remembering that night, the isolation, and the sense of being hunted. It was a terrifying lesson, but one that kept me alive. I had been looking forward to a week in the woods for months. My life in the city was exhausting. Long hours at work, constant noise, and endless small obligations that left me drained. When I found a small cabin for rent deep in the mountains, far from the main roads and any towns, I jumped at the chance. It was a modest place, built from weathered logs, with a tin roof and a chimney that promised warmth on cold nights. I packed enough food for a week, a water filter, batteries, and basic camping gear, thinking it would be a peaceful retreat. I imagined myself reading by the fireplace, walking through the forest, and simply existing without the pressure of deadlines or obligations. The drive up was longer than I expected. The GPS kept leading me down gravel roads that became narrower and more overgrown. But eventually, the cabin appeared, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The trees were thick and tall, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I parked my car on the edge of the clearing and walked up to the cabin. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the wood worn from years of rain and sun. A small stack of firewood leaned against the side wall. There was no electricity, just a single solar panel mounted on the roof. The isolation felt good at first. The inside of the cabin was small but functional. There was a single room with a bed against one wall, a kitchenette with a tiny stove, and a wood-burning fireplace opposite the bed. A window looked out into the forest, giving me a view of the dense trees and a small stream I could hear in the distance. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. I unpacked my things, stacked firewood in the corner, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The room slowly warmed, and I felt a sense of satisfaction seeing the flames crackle. The first night was quiet, but not in a comforting way. I could hear the wind pushing through the trees, making the branches scrape against each other and the cabin walls. At times, the sound was sharp and sudden, making me jump. Somewhere in the distance, an animal cried out, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the forest. It reminded me that I was alone, completely alone, surrounded by a wilderness I barely understood. I tried to read, but the darkness outside seemed to press in on the windows. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep, leaving the fire to die down to embers. The following day, I went for a hike. The trail started just behind the cabin, disappearing quickly into the thick forest. The trees were tall, and their branches interlocked overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. Moss covered the ground, making my footing uncertain. Birds called to each other, and small animals rustled in the undergrowth. I found a small clearing with a stream running through it. I filled my water bottle and sat on a rock, listening to the water gurgle and the wind in the trees. The peacefulness was addictive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw nothing and no one. That evening, I prepared a simple meal, then settled near the fireplace with a blanket. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees swayed violently. Occasionally, I would hear a loud snap of a branch, followed by a dull thud that suggested something had fallen to the ground. I assumed it was a tree or a large branch, nothing more. Still, the sounds made me uneasy. On the third day, I went farther than before. I followed the trail until I reached an old dirt road, overgrown but still visible. I walked along it for a while, hoping it would lead to a better view of the mountains. The forest was denser here, darker, and the air felt heavier. I passed an abandoned cabin, smaller and more dilapidated than mine. Its windows were broken, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I looked inside briefly but saw nothing but shadows and dust. I felt a twinge of fear and decided to head back, but the road seemed longer than before. By the time I returned to my cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the forest. That night was different. The wind was stronger, howling through the trees and rattling the cabin. I could hear something moving outside, heavier than an animal, deliberate. I kept thinking it might be a deer or a bear, but the sound didn't match anything I recognized. It circled the cabin slowly, making me tense each time I heard a step or a branch snap. I checked the windows and doors, everything was locked, and the fire provided some comfort. But sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside, imagining every possibility, every danger. On the fourth day, I decided to check the perimeter. I wanted to make sure nothing could get into the cabin. As I walked around, I noticed footprints in the soft soil near the back of the cabin. They were large, and the spacing suggested a human, not an animal. My heart sank. I had assumed I was alone, and now there was proof someone had been near the cabin, possibly recently. I followed the tracks cautiously, keeping the cabin in sight. They led into the forest and disappeared quickly. My stomach churned. I couldn't tell if it was someone who had been here before, perhaps the previous tenant, or if it was a stranger who had come by recently. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest town was hours away, and the dirt roads were confusing. I told myself to stay calm and remain cautious. I reinforced the door, piled some logs near the windows to make them harder to break, and sharpened a small hatchet I had brought for firewood. I made sure my phone was charged, though service was spotty in the area. I tried to focus on mundane tasks to distract myself, but my nerves were frayed. Every sound outside, the wind, a falling branch, a rustle, made my heart race. That night, the sounds outside escalated. It wasn't just branches or wind anymore. Something heavy was moving around the cabin, slow but deliberate, circling repeatedly. I could hear the faint crunch of footsteps in the dirt, stopping and starting. I gripped the hatchet tightly and tried to remain as quiet as possible. The cabin felt small and vulnerable, like it could be breached at any moment. I checked the locks again, and for the first time I wished I had a firearm. By the early morning, the noises stopped. I waited until light to step outside. The footprints were still there, surrounding the cabin in a wide circle, then disappearing into the woods. There was no sign of anyone still nearby. The experience left me shaken. I couldn't sleep properly anymore, constantly listening for any movement. Over the next few days, I stayed mostly inside, venturing out only briefly for water and food. The isolation had turned from peaceful to terrifying. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. The forest that had seemed beautiful and serene now felt like a cage, filled with unseen eyes. I reinforced everything I could, doors, windows, even the fireplace chimney, and kept the hatchet close. My body ached from tension, my mind replaying every sound and shadow endlessly. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stay indefinitely. I had to leave while I still could. I packed quickly, taking only essential items, and loaded them into my car. The drive back down the mountain was tense. Every curve in the road, every shadow among the trees, made me nervous. I constantly checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me, though I knew it was unlikely. By the time I reached the main highway, I felt a cautious relief. The density of the forest and the isolation of the cabin had magnified every small fear, every imagined threat. Once back in the city, in the noise and lights of civilization, I could finally breathe normally. I never returned to the cabin. Later, I heard from the rental agency that other guests had reported hearing noises outside at night, seeing footprints, and sometimes feeling watched, but there was never evidence of trespassers. The place was eventually taken off the rental market, left to decay into the forest. Even months later, I could recall the details, the circling footsteps, the shadows through the trees, the oppressive quiet of the forest at night. It wasn't supernatural, but it was enough to make me feel hunted, vulnerable, and deeply unsettled. I learned a lot about the fragility of comfort and the way isolation can twist ordinary sounds into threats. That week left me with a deep respect for nature and an understanding of how fear can make even familiar landscapes feel dangerous. I had always wanted to spend a weekend in a remote cabin. Not one of those crowded tourist spots with other people shouting and the smell of barbecue filling the air. I wanted something isolated, deep in the woods, where I could be completely alone and disconnected from the world. The idea of silence and solitude had drawn me in for months, and when I finally found a small cabin for rent on a barely advertised website, I didn't hesitate. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin with a single story, surrounded by dense forest, with a small clearing in front. The website said it was perfect for a quiet retreat. I didn't care about electricity or water supply. I wanted real isolation. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, winding along narrow, cracked roads lined with tall pine trees. The air had a damp smell, like moss and wet leaves, and the sunlight broke through the branches in long golden shafts. Felt peaceful, almost dreamlike. When I finally turned onto a tiny dirt track, I realized that I hadn't seen another car in hours. The trees pressed in on both sides, and the track was narrow enough that I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the sides. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, though somehow more real and less polished. The wood was weathered, and the porch sagged slightly under the weight of years of neglect. The windows were dusty, and the door's paint was chipped. I parked and got out, taking a deep breath. The silence was immediate, the kind that presses against your ears and makes them feel sensitive. No birds, no wind, just the faint rustle of the forest around me. It was deeper than city silence, heavier somehow. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly musty, like damp fabric left in a corner. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a couch that had lost most of its stuffing, and a simple bed in the corner. There was a wood stove in the center of the main room, its blackened surface telling me it had been used many times. I set my backpack down and went straight for the windows. Outside, the forest pressed in on all sides. I could barely see the road I had driven in on, and the thick underbrush looked impenetrable in places. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin, checking the cabinets and drawers. There was some basic kitchenware, old but usable. A few cans of food were left behind, probably by the owner. There was a small stack of firewood near the stove, and I decided I would get a fire going once night fell. I didn't want to wait too long. I had read that remote cabins could get very cold at night, even in early autumn. The sun began to lower in the sky. The golden shafts through the trees slowly turned to long shadows. I noticed that the forest seemed to change as the light dimmed. Shapes that were invisible in daylight began to form, branches twisting, rocks looking like something else, and the air itself seemed heavier. I shook off the unease. I had expected isolation to be uncomfortable at first. I set up the stove and got a fire going. The flames sputtered at first, then caught properly, and the cabin filled with the smell of burning wood. I had brought a few canned meals, a loaf of bread, and a small supply of water. I cooked and ate quietly, sitting near the fire, listening to the forest. As the sun disappeared completely, the forest outside turned black. I could hear things moving, small animals, birds settling in for the night, but nothing large, nothing threatening, or so I told myself. After dinner, I went to the bedroom to get my sleeping bag. The bed was old and hard, but I was too tired to care. I set the sleeping bag on top and lay down. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fire. I felt my eyelids grow heavy. That was when I heard it for the first time. It started as a soft thud, coming from outside. I froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, rhythmic. It was not a deer or any normal animal. I could hear it moving around the cabin, coming from the side where the trees pressed in closest. My heart began to race, and I told myself it was probably a branch falling, or some small animal hopping from tree to tree. But then the thud came again, closer, heavier. It was followed by the sound of dry leaves crunching under something's weight. I sat up and tried to listen. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the shadows on the walls larger. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but I remembered I had no service here. Not a single bar. I had told myself I didn't need it, that I would enjoy the isolation, but now I regretted it. I got up and quietly moved toward the window, trying to look out without making any noise. The darkness outside was almost complete, but I could just make out shapes moving among the trees. Nothing solid, nothing I could clearly identify, just movement, shifting shapes. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away from the window slowly. Whoever or whatever it was, they were outside. I thought about running, but I had no clear idea of where to go. The nearest road was far, and I had no car keys outside. The thought that someone might have followed me here flickered briefly. Seemed impossible, but the fear gnawed at me. I decided the only thing I could do was barricade the cabin door. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, then pushed the couch against it. I made sure the windows were closed and latched, though I knew that would not stop someone if they really wanted in. Hours passed. Every sound outside made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, an occasional heavy thump that made me press myself against the wall. I didn't dare go near the window again. I stayed by the fire, keeping it alive as best I could. I checked my backpack repeatedly, thinking maybe I had left something I could use for protection, but all I had was a pocket knife and a flashlight. Not much against a determined intruder. Eventually, the sounds stopped. Nothing moved outside. The forest became quiet again, though not the same quiet as before. The silence now felt oppressive, charged with something unseen. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, pacing the cabin, constantly checking the windows and door. Every time I heard the wind or a branch scraping the cabin, I flinched. The night stretched endlessly. The first light, I saw the tracks. There were footprints in the dirt near the cabin, large, booted prints, not animal. They circled the cabin and disappeared into the trees. The fear I had felt during the night came back, sharp and burning. Whoever had been outside had been watching, waiting. The thought of staying another night made my stomach turn. I packed quickly, double-checked the cabin to make sure I had left nothing behind, and got into my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The drive back was tense. I kept looking in the mirrors, expecting to see someone following me. The forest seemed darker now, less inviting. Every crackling branch, every shadow in the trees made me flinch. It took hours to get back to the main road. When I finally saw the first signs of civilization, houses, cars, people, it was like stepping into another world. I pulled over and sat in the parking lot of a small store, catching my breath. I reported the tracks to the local ranger when I got a chance. They said the area was remote and that sometimes hikers or hunters wandered around. They couldn't say if anyone had been targeting cabins, but they agreed that the tracks suggested a human presence. They offered to send someone to check the cabin, but I declined. I didn't want to go back. The experience stayed with me for months. I replayed it in my mind constantly, thinking about what could have happened if I had gone to sleep, if I had left the door unsecured. I realized that the real danger wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale creature. It was human. Someone had been there, lurking, observing, and I had been completely alone with no way to call for help. The forest, the cabin, the isolation. They all seemed beautiful and peaceful in the daylight, but at night they became a trap. I never went back to a remote cabin. I still enjoy nature, but I stick to crowded campsites, to places where other people are around. The fear I felt that night was real, tangible, and it taught me that solitude in the wrong place can be dangerous. I carry that lesson with me whenever I go outdoors, and I pay more attention to the details I used to ignore. Who else is around, how far I am from help, and how quickly I can leave if something feels wrong. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the thuds in the dark, the footsteps circling the cabin, and I feel that same pulse of fear. But I also feel relief because I survived. I made it out, and I learned to respect the wilderness, not just as a place of beauty, but as a place that can turn against you if you are not careful. That weekend taught me more than I ever expected. It changed the way I approach the world, the way I think about isolation, and the way I prepare for it. The cabin remains in my memory as a symbol of that thin line between safety and danger, between peace and fear. And every time I think of it, I remember the importance of caution, vigilance, and respect for the unknown. The forest itself was not evil, but the solitude revealed that danger often comes in human form, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment. That was the scariest part of all, and the part that stayed with me the longest. I never thought that a simple weekend getaway could turn into the kind of nightmare that seems impossible in hindsight. I had always liked the idea of solitude, of leaving the city behind, of getting away from the constant noise of cars, phones, and people. So when I found a cabin for rent deep in the forest, far from any road, I thought it would be the perfect retreat. The online listing promised a small, rustic cabin, fully furnished, with running water, electricity, and a fireplace. The pictures showed a log cabin surrounded by thick trees, a little clearing in front, and a small pond a few hundred yards away. It seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I dismissed any concerns as I drove up to the place, my car crunching over the dirt road that led into the woods. The cabin was even more isolated than I had imagined. There were no neighbors, no cell signal, and the nearest town was at least 20 miles away. That was fine by me. I liked the thought of being completely alone. I parked in front of the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, the kind of clean, sharp air that makes your lungs feel full. I carried my bag inside, and for a moment, I just stood in the cabin, taking in the silence. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as I walked. I unpacked my things slowly, making sure everything was in order. The first day passed without incident. I explored the surrounding woods, walked along the pond, and even found a small trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. I collected firewood for the fireplace and made a simple dinner. The evening was calm. I lit a fire, sat on the couch with a blanket, and read a book until the flames died down. Outside, the sun set in a wash of orange and red, and the shadows of the trees grew long and distorted. I didn't notice anything unusual at first, just the usual sounds of wildlife. An owl hooting somewhere in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the whisper of the wind through the branches. It was the second night that started to unsettle me. I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but then I realized it was a rhythmic thumping, almost like footsteps. I froze in bed, straining my ears. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere near the front of the cabin. I debated getting up, convincing myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon or some other forest creature. But the steps didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard. They were too deliberate, too measured, and too heavy. I stayed in bed for a long time, trying to convince myself to ignore it, but the sound continued for almost an hour. Eventually, it stopped, and I drifted back to an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints, nothing that suggested another person had been there. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. The third day, I decided to go further into the woods. I packed some food, water, and my phone, though I had no signal, and took the trail I had found the day before. The forest was dense, and the trail wound unpredictably through thick undergrowth and towering trees. I kept track of my path carefully, marking the trees with small scratches and broken branches so I could find my way back. Hours passed, and the sunlight began to fade as I ventured deeper. That's when I noticed something strange. There were signs that someone else had been there recently. A few feet away from the trail, there were disturbed leaves, small footprints that didn't match any animal I knew. They were human footprints, size unknown, but fresh enough to make me uneasy. I turned around to head back, but then I realized I had lost the trail. My markers were gone, trampled or erased by someone or something that had passed by. Panic set in, but I tried to stay calm. I retraced my steps, but the forest had a way of disorienting me. Every tree looked the same, every path twisted and turned unpredictably. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my lungs burning. The shadows were growing long, and the sky was darkening faster than I expected. I was lost. I eventually stumbled upon a small clearing, a shallow depression surrounded by trees. I decided to stay there until I figured out my next move. I could hear the forest at night, the sounds of distant animals, the crackle of branches under unseen feet, the whisper of wind through the leaves. But then I started hearing something different. A snapping of twigs, a rustle in the underbrush, and then faint, slow steps approaching the clearing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Whoever it was, they hadn't seen me yet. I ducked behind a tree, trying to stay as still as possible. The steps stopped. I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, close by. I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, I couldn't tell. Then the steps moved away, slowly, deliberately, retreating back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I ran blindly through the forest, crashing through branches, tripping over roots, ignoring the scratches and bruises I was picking up. All I could think about was getting back to the cabin, to safety, to something familiar. By some miracle, I recognized a tree I had marked earlier. Relief flooded me, but it was mixed with a lingering fear. I finally reached the cabin as night fully settled. I locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and sat in the corner, too scared to move. The rest of the night was a torturous vigil. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't stop imagining what, or who, had been in the woods. I thought about calling the police, but I had no signal. I thought about leaving in my car, but the road was distant, and it would take hours to reach safety. I was completely alone and completely vulnerable. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed as quickly as I could, scanning the cabin constantly for any sign of intruders. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and anything of value I could carry, and I started walking toward the dirt road. The forest was quiet during the day, almost unnaturally so, and every sound made me jump. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But I saw no one. After an hour, I finally reached the road. My car was exactly where I had left it, and I got inside, locking the doors immediately. I didn't even start the engine at first. I just sat there, catching my breath, my hands shaking, my heart still racing. Then I drove away as fast as I could, dirt and rocks kicking up behind the tires, until the trees thinned and the first signs of civilization appeared. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in the nearest town. I bought a map, made a call from the payphone, and reported the incident to the local authorities. The police told me that the forest around the cabin was known for occasional trespassers, sometimes people hiding from the law or living off the grid. They said it was possible I had stumbled across one of them, and that my instincts to leave immediately probably saved me. I returned home the next day, exhausted and shaken. I didn't sleep for a week after that, haunted by the memory of the footsteps in the night, the rustling of the underbrush, and the sheer vulnerability of being alone in an isolated place. The cabin was supposed to be an escape, a place of peace, but instead, it had become a reminder of how fragile our sense of safety really is. Months later, I learned that the cabin had been abandoned for years before being rented out. The owner had only recently renovated it, but he admitted that he hadn't checked the surrounding area thoroughly. The forest around it had a reputation among locals as a place where people sometimes vanished for days or weeks, often without a trace. That knowledge did little to ease my mind. I never returned, and I never will. I sometimes think about that weekend, about how close I had come to being trapped or worse, and I realize that isolation, while tempting, carries risks that aren't always visible until it's too late. The memory of the steps, deliberate and unyielding in the darkness, stays with me. It reminds me every day that safety is never guaranteed, and that sometimes the most terrifying experiences come not from the supernatural, but from the unpredictability of real human beings and the wilderness around us. I never thought a weekend in a cabin could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had always loved the idea of getting away from the city, leaving behind the constant hum of traffic, the bright lights, the crowds. I thought a quiet cabin in the woods would be the perfect escape, a place to clear my head, read some books, and spend some time alone with my thoughts. I had found a small cabin on a rental site, tucked away in a remote area near a state forest. The pictures were simple: a small wooden cabin, surrounded by tall pines, a clearing just big enough for a fire pit, and a small dirt road leading back to the main highway. It seemed perfect. I didn't know that perfect could turn into terrifying in just a matter of hours. The drive out there was long, about 4 hours from my apartment. I packed lightly, just the basics. Some food, water, clothes, a flashlight, batteries, and a small first aid kit. I had cell service when I left the city, but I knew that deep in the forest, my phone would probably be useless. I told myself that was a good thing. No distractions, no calls, no messages, just quiet. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding. It started as asphalt, then turned to gravel, and finally into a dirt trail that I could barely call a road. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches brushing the roof of my car as I drove slowly, trying not to get stuck in the soft dirt. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The light was beautiful, golden, almost peaceful, and I felt a surge of excitement. Soon I would be there, away from everything, alone in the quiet woods. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting completely, and the woods were taking on that deep, dim color that feels both calm and eerie. The cabin was exactly as the photos had shown. Small, wooden, with a tin roof that reflected the fading sunlight. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, though I had no idea if it was real or just leftover residue. I parked my car near the cabin and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the silence. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a smell that always made me feel calm. But tonight, it carried a sharp edge, almost like it was warning me to be careful. The first thing I did was check inside the cabin. It was small, maybe 2 rooms. A living area with a small couch, a table, and a tiny kitchenette, and a back room that seemed to be the bedroom. Everything was clean, though it smelled faintly of wood smoke and mustiness, which was normal for an older cabin. The electricity was functional, but I could tell it was limited. The refrigerator hummed softly, and a single overhead light illuminated the room. I unpacked a few things, set my backpack on the table, and then walked out to the clearing behind the cabin. There was a fire pit, some chairs, and a stack of firewood. I felt that satisfying mixture of relief and accomplishment that comes with knowing you've made it somewhere isolated and safe. Night fell quickly. I started a fire in the pit, the smoke curling into the cool night air. The stars were bright, so much brighter than anything I could see in the city. It was silent in a way that felt strange at first, almost oppressive. You could hear the smallest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under an unseen animal's feet. I reminded myself to stay calm. Animals were normal. Forests made noises at night. I sat near the fire, reading a book I had brought, trying to enjoy the isolation. That's when I first noticed it, the sound of footsteps on the dirt road leading to the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy, deliberate. They weren't soft, like an animal's, they were thudding, slow, careful. I froze, listening. The steps moved closer, but they didn't get all the way to the cabin. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing. My heart rate spiked. I told myself it was probably a hiker or someone driving down the road, but the area was so remote that the thought of anyone else being here at night seemed unlikely. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought and shone it toward the edge of the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest floor and the trunks of the trees. Nothing, no one, just shadows stretching and twisting between the trunks. I waited. The steps didn't continue, didn't retreat. Silence. I didn't hear a car, didn't hear any rustling. Just nothing. I decided I had imagined it. The fire was starting to die down, and I felt a chill in the air. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned on a small lamp. I tried to focus on my book, but every few minutes I would pause, listening. The forest seemed almost too quiet now, too patient. I told myself that was normal, too, that forests feel different at night, that human ears were not made for complete silence, that my imagination was working overtime. I went to bed early. The cabin was small, the bed narrow but soft enough. I left the flashlight on the nightstand, and the door locked, feeling a false sense of security. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and the tension of the day. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was soft, intermittent, almost like scratching. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The scratching came again, from somewhere outside. I froze, listening. It was slow, deliberate, not random. Came from the side of the cabin, near the back. I got up quietly, careful not to make noise, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the door just a crack. The forest was black, the fire long dead. I shone the beam around the clearing, along the edge of the tree-line. Nothing. I stepped out slowly, my boots crunching on the dirt, and shone the flashlight along the side of the cabin. That's when I saw it. A faint outline, a shadow, crouched near the window. My heart stopped. It wasn't moving, but it was there. My first thought was to run, but the cabin door was behind me, and I couldn't see if the figure was alone. The scratching started again, closer now, coming from the roof of the cabin. I looked up. At first, I thought it was a branch rubbing against the tin roof. Then I saw the movement. A dark figure climbing, hands and feet moving with terrifying precision. My stomach dropped. This wasn't an animal. I ran back inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing. No bars. My mind raced. I tried to stay calm, told myself to think logically. There were no guns in the cabin, no weapons. The nearest neighbor was miles away. All I had were the locks, the doors, and my instincts. The scratching stopped. Silence returned. But I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. Every creak of the wooden floor, every snap of a branch outside, made my heart leap. I felt trapped, isolated, completely vulnerable. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell in that haze of fear. At first light, I made a plan. I couldn't stay inside forever. The figure could come back at any moment. I packed my bag quickly, making sure I had water, my car keys, and the essentials. I left the cabin as quietly as possible, careful to check the surrounding area. Nothing. No footprints, no signs anyone had been there besides me. I ran down the dirt road to my car, heart hammering, eyes scanning the trees. I didn't know if the person was still around, if they had left, or if they were waiting. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove slowly at first, then faster as the adrenaline kicked in. The forest felt alive around me. Every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a warning. It took hours to reach a main road, a paved highway, a place where there were other cars, other people, signs of civilization. I didn't stop until I was back in a small town, parked at a gas station, breathing hard, hands trembling. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the cabin, the location, the events of the night. They said there had been recent reports of break-ins in the area, that people had been camping and returning to find their cabins ransacked or their cars broken into. I never went back to that cabin. I never tried to find another remote cabin in the woods. The fear, the helplessness I felt that night stayed with me for a long time. It was the first time I realized that isolation can be dangerous, that the forest isn't always peaceful, and that people can be more terrifying than any story or ghost. I still think about that night sometimes. The way the forest was silent, the way the figure moved, the way my own body betrayed me with trembling hands and pounding heart. But I also remember the lessons it taught me. I learned to prepare, to be cautious, to respect isolation, and to trust my instincts. I learned that fear is not just in stories or movies. It's very real, and it can hit you when you least expect it, in a place that seems perfectly safe. The ending, however, is clear. I survived. I got away. I learned from the experience. I never let fear control my life, but I also never underestimate the danger of being alone in the woods. I told myself I would be smarter next time, more prepared. I researched safety measures for remote cabins, carrying pepper spray, emergency radios, and other precautions. I made sure my friends knew my location whenever I went somewhere isolated. Years later, I returned to the forest, but this time to a public campground with other people around, never alone, always aware of my surroundings. I built fires, walked trails, and slept in tents, but I never again took isolation lightly. That night in the cabin changed me. It taught me vigilance, awareness, and the importance of preparation. It also gave me a strange respect for the forest, not as a magical place, but as a place where nature and humanity coexist, and where a single mistake, a single moment of vulnerability, can turn peace into terror. Now, whenever I drive past a cabin in the woods, I glance at it carefully, remembering the night I thought I was alone, and realized I never truly were. The memory is vivid. The darkness, the sound of the steps, the shadow on the roof, the pounding of my heart. But it also reminds me that I survived, that I made it back, and that sometimes real fear teaches the most valuable lessons. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The plan was simple: escape the city, leave behind all the noise and stress, and spend a few days alone in a small cabin I had rented in the mountains. I had pictures of it online, rustic and isolated, tucked into a dense forest where the only sounds were supposed to be wind and birds. I wanted peace, some time to myself to think, read, hike, and just breathe. I didn't expect what actually happened. The drive up to the cabin had been longer than I anticipated. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky by the time I turned onto the dirt road that led to the property. The road was narrow, rough, and flanked by trees so tall they blocked the last light of day. My car rattled along, and I felt a knot of unease start to form, though I told myself it was just nerves, that being alone in the wilderness made people feel things differently. I had done solo hikes before, so I tried to shrug off the feeling. When I finally saw the cabin, relief washed over me. It was small, wooden, 2 stories, and looked even more isolated than the pictures suggested. A thin chimney jutted up from the roof, smoke curling into the fading sky, though I doubted anyone else was there. The surrounding forest was dense, the underbrush thick, and I realized I could barely see a neighboring cabin if there was one. That fact should have unsettled me, but at the time it felt like freedom. I unloaded my bag, double-checking that I had brought all the essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, matches, extra blankets, and a small propane stove. The cabin itself was old but solid. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air inside smelled faintly of damp wood and the lingering scent of cleaning solution. The windows were dusty, and I noticed streaks as if rain had run down them, though the sky was clear. I set my bag down, unpacked, and started to explore. The first thing I did was check the perimeter. The cabin had a small porch, a narrow fire pit in the front yard, and a path leading into the forest that disappeared almost immediately into the shadows. There were no neighbors visible, no other cars parked nearby, nothing but trees and the fading light. I tried to dismiss the feeling of isolation that began to press on me. It wasn't fear exactly, just a gnawing awareness that I was completely alone. I went inside, made some coffee, and settled into a chair by the window. The forest outside was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to focus on my book, but I kept glancing up, expecting to see someone, or something, moving among the trees. Nothing ever was there, just shadows, swaying branches, and the fading light. Night came fast. I lit the small propane stove to cook a simple meal. The fire from the stove cast flickering shadows across the walls, making every corner seem darker than it really was. I kept checking the locks on the doors, even though I knew they were fine. Every little sound made me jump. A branch tapping against the window, the wind shifting, leaves rustling across the porch. By midnight, I was tired but uneasy. I climbed into bed, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it. A sound of deliberate movement outside, soft but distinct. Footsteps? I froze, straining my ears. The cabin floor creaked under my bed as I shifted, making the sound outside pause for a moment. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the way the noise moved, deliberately along the perimeter of the cabin, made me doubt it. My heart raced. I didn't own a firearm, and the only weapon I had was a small pocket knife in my bag. I stayed as still as possible, listening. The steps paused, then slowly moved away. I waited for what felt like hours, but after a while, only the wind remained. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing, that I was alone, that my mind was playing tricks, but I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every tiny noise made me tense. I watched the shadows in the room, imagining someone standing just out of sight. Morning brought no comfort. I went outside, scanning the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. Nothing. The dirt road I had driven on showed no recent tire tracks besides my own. Still, the unease lingered. I tried to hike to clear my head, following a path that led deeper into the forest. The forest was thick and quiet, almost too quiet. Birds rarely sang, and even squirrels seemed absent. I felt a tight knot of tension in my chest, and I found myself constantly looking behind me. On the second night, the footsteps returned, louder this time. I had decided to lock all the doors and windows, but the sound came from the back, near the small shed at the edge of the property. Whoever or whatever was there, they were careful, deliberate. They didn't try to break in, not yet, but they wanted me to know they were there. I spent the night in the main room, moving furniture to barricade myself near the window I could see best from, and trying to listen. The sounds outside continued until dawn. By the third day, I realized I couldn't stay inside any longer. I needed to get out, but the nearest town was over 30 miles away on narrow forest roads. I decided to wait until morning, hoping the intruder or intruders would leave. That night, I stayed awake, using every ounce of energy to keep watch. The tension was unbearable. I started planning. If someone came in, I would grab my bag, go to the shed, and try to escape through the trees. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The shed looked untouched, but the back door of the cabin showed signs that someone had tried to pry it open. Scratches in the wood, small chips where the frame had been nudged. I felt panic rising but tried to keep my mind clear. I packed my things quickly, made sure my car was ready, and stayed alert for any sound. Every shadow, every tree, every small movement made my heart pound. I drove down the dirt road with nerves on edge, constantly scanning the sides of the road for movement. The forest seemed endless, oppressive, and every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. When I finally reached the paved road, relief washed over me, but I didn't relax until I reached the town. I went straight to the nearest gas station, called the rental company to report the incident, and explained as best I could what had happened. They said no one else had been on the property recently, but the police told me that in isolated areas, trespassers or squatters sometimes camped nearby, observing cabins before deciding to approach. After that weekend, I never returned to the cabin. I realized that the quiet I had sought in isolation was dangerous in its own way. People can do things in the woods that go unnoticed for days, and being alone removes any safety net. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that the forest, however beautiful, can be a place of real danger, not stories or legends, just human presence and unpredictability. I now make sure that when I go into remote areas, I am never alone, that I always have a way to call for help, and that I always trust the feeling in my gut. That weekend taught me that isolation is not freedom, it's exposure. It's being vulnerable in a way that you can't imagine until you've lived it. I don't go into forests unprepared anymore, and I never underestimate how careful someone watching from the shadows can be. The cabin itself was just wood and nails, but the fear it created was something I carry with me even now, years later. It was early October when I decided to take some time off from work and escape to the woods for a while. I had been under an incredible amount of stress, and the thought of leaving the city, with its constant noise, traffic, and people, sounded like pure relief. I found a small cabin through a listing online, located deep in a forest about 6 hours from the nearest town. The photos looked inviting. A rustic wooden structure surrounded by tall pines, a small porch, and a view of a frozen-looking lake in the distance. There was no cell phone signal, the listing said, and I took that as a bonus. I wanted silence, solitude, and a chance to clear my head. The drive was long, but the scenery made it bearable. As I left the last town behind, the road narrowed, becoming a rough dirt track lined with trees that seemed to press together overhead, forming a tunnel of branches and leaves. Shadows moved as the late afternoon sun sank lower, but I hardly noticed. I was focused on finally reaching the cabin. When I turned the last corner, there it was, sitting alone in a clearing, looking exactly like the photos. The forest around it was dense, quiet, and still, almost unnaturally so. The silence itself had weight. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and pine needles. I took a deep breath and felt my shoulders relax for the first time in months. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of dark wood, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. I carried my bag inside, noting the simple furnishings. A bed, a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a table with a single chair. There were shelves with some supplies, canned food, a few cleaning products, a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the door. There was a small old radio, but it was broken. No surprise. The windows gave a clear view of the surrounding forest and the lake beyond. I unpacked, setting my bag on the floor, and then went outside to inspect the surroundings. The clearing was bigger than it seemed in the photos. The ground was covered with dry leaves, and the trees formed a natural barrier around the cabin. I could hear the faint rustle of small animals in the underbrush and the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. I walked down to the lake, its surface still and dark, reflecting the sky in a way that made it hard to tell where water ended and land began. The sun was falling fast, and I knew night would come sooner here than in the city, blocked as it was by the tall trees. I returned to the cabin and lit the wood stove. The fire crackled, filling the room with warmth and a sense of temporary security. I made a simple dinner, feeling that comforting emptiness that comes from being alone, away from everyone and everything. Night fell quickly, and the cabin became almost entirely dark, except for the light from the stove. The silence was thick, not peaceful anymore, but heavy and expectant. Outside, the wind picked up, moving through the branches, making a constant creaking sound. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see something moving among the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, just shadows. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly, but the noises outside kept me awake. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier than a branch breaking, like a footstep on the soft forest floor. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. My heart was racing, but I told myself I was imagining things, that the forest had its own rhythm and I was not used to it. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The cabin was cold, and the fire had died out overnight. I dressed quickly and went outside. The forest was cloaked in mist, and the lake looked gray and empty. I tried to shake off the lingering unease from the previous night. I decided to go for a walk, keeping near the cabin, exploring the forest to familiarize myself with the area. The underbrush was thick in places, and the ground was uneven, covered with roots and fallen branches. I noticed animal tracks, deer, maybe a fox, and I tried to follow them to see where they led. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, but also the more alive the forest seemed. Every crackle of leaves, every bird call, every sudden rustle made me alert, but I kept telling myself I was alone, safe, and prepared. By mid-morning, I returned to the cabin and ate breakfast. The silence felt heavier now, almost oppressive. I realized that in the city, background noise fills every moment, drowning out small disturbances. But here, in the deep forest, everything stood out. I heard a snapping sound outside that made me freeze. It was faint, but it was deliberate, not like a branch falling. I looked toward the trees but saw nothing. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A raccoon? Maybe a hiker? But I had seen no one, and the road was too rough for a car. I shook it off, but the unease stayed with me. That afternoon, I decided to cut some firewood. The stack by the cabin was enough for a couple of nights, but I wanted to be sure. I grabbed an axe from the shed and started chopping. The repetitive motion was comforting at first, almost meditative. But as I worked, I kept glancing toward the tree line, feeling like I was being watched. Each time I looked, there was nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. I tried to focus on chopping, on the rhythm of the axe hitting wood, but every sound, the crunch of leaves under my feet, the wind, even the distant call of a bird, felt amplified. My imagination began running wild. I kept thinking about what I would do if someone was out there. I wasn't worried about ghosts or mythical creatures. I was worried about people. The thought of someone in these woods, near my cabin, uninvited, was terrifying in its realism. I finished chopping enough wood for several nights and brought it inside, stacking it neatly by the stove. It was late afternoon when I finally allowed myself to sit and relax. I made coffee and looked out the window at the lake. The mist had thickened, making the trees on the opposite shore almost invisible. It was beautiful, but it also felt isolating, like I was on my own little island with nothing but the trees and the cold water surrounding me. I tried to push the uneasy thoughts aside and focus on my writing. I had brought a journal, intending to document my time here, and I wrote for a while, trying to capture the quiet of the forest in words. But my concentration kept breaking whenever I heard a sound outside. The night came again, colder and darker than the previous one. I lit the stove, set up a small reading lamp, and sat near the window watching. Around 9, I heard it. Something heavy moving through the underbrush, too deliberate for an animal. My stomach dropped. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a deer, but the sound continued. Soft, slow, crunching footsteps, circling the cabin. I could see nothing through the dark, dense trees, just shadows and shapes. I realized then that I had underestimated how isolated I really was. The nearest neighbors were miles away, the road barely visible, and there was no signal on my phone. If someone wanted to get to me, there would be no help until morning. My heart raced, but I didn't panic. I knew panicking would get me nowhere. I quietly moved to the closet, where I had stored a small hunting rifle I always carried for emergencies. I had experience with firearms and had cleaned it meticulously before leaving. I loaded it carefully, then listened. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to detect any movement. Nothing. I told myself to stay calm, that I needed to wait and observe. Every instinct was on alert. I sat by the window until the first signs of dawn, never letting my eyes leave the treeline. Morning came, pale and cold, and with it a sense of relief. I searched around the cabin perimeter, looking for tracks, signs of intrusion, anything that would explain the sounds from the night before. I found some footprints in the mud near the back of the cabin, partially washed by overnight dew, too large for any animal I had seen. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest. My unease turned into concrete fear. Someone had been near the cabin last night. I spent the rest of the morning inspecting the cabin and securing all doors and windows, making sure nothing could be forced open. I moved furniture around near the entrances, creating makeshift barricades with whatever I had on hand. I even set a few small tripwires using cans and string, primitive alarms, but anything to alert me if someone came near again. For the next 2 days, I stayed hyper-aware. I didn't leave the cabin except to bring in firewood and to check the immediate surroundings. Each time I went outside, I walked slowly, eyes scanning every tree, every shadow, every movement. I found more footprints, larger ones, not human exactly, but large boots, and some that looked older from several days before. The forest was no longer a peaceful retreat. It was a maze full of potential danger. Sleep was impossible, or at least fitful. I kept the rifle by the bed, the lamp lit, the stove warm. I began rationing my food and water just in case. On the third night, the intrusions escalated. There were scratches on the wooden walls, deep enough to leave splinters. The firewood pile had been disturbed. It was clear that someone had been in the cabin while I was away during the day. My fear became vigilance. I stayed awake all night, keeping my eyes on the windows and doors, listening for the slightest sound. The wind, the rustle of branches, every creak became a signal. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I held my breath, watching, waiting. The shadows moved in a way that confirmed someone was out there. My finger rested on the trigger, my mind racing with possible outcomes. I didn't panic, but I felt the tension in every muscle. Hours passed like this, each second stretching endlessly. By dawn, the intruder had vanished, leaving no footprints, no sign. Only the disturbed firewood and scratches on the walls. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I gathered my things quietly, keeping an eye on the forest, and packed the car as quickly as I could. I had noticed tire tracks near the main road the previous night, suggesting someone had been watching or following me from outside. I drove cautiously, constantly scanning the roadside and the tree line. Every shadow, every curve in the road felt like a threat. 6 hours later, I arrived back in town, exhausted and drained, but relieved to be in civilization again. I reported the intrusion to the local authorities, providing details about the tracks, scratches, and the disturbances. They took a report and warned me that the forest could be dangerous and that some isolated cabins had been targeted by thieves or vandals. Back in my apartment, with the lights on and doors locked, I finally began to relax. The cabin had been everything I expected in terms of solitude, but the reality of isolation had almost cost me dearly. I realized that being alone in such a remote place left you vulnerable in ways I had never considered. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also unforgiving, and solitude was a double-edged sword. I kept thinking about the footprints, the scratches, the sense that someone had been so close, so silent. The relief of safety was powerful, but so was the memory of the nights spent watching shadows, waiting for a sound that might never come. I never returned to that cabin. I told myself I would eventually, but I never did. I bought another place closer to town, with neighbors nearby and lights that never went out. Sometimes I still think about that forest, the lake, the isolation, and the intruder I never saw. The fear I felt was real, raw, and unshakable, and it taught me that nature, while beautiful, could also be terrifying in its silence. The memory of those nights stayed with me, a constant reminder of how fragile security is when you are completely alone. And yet, even with the fear, I sometimes crave the peace of the woods, but only from a safe distance, behind locked doors and within the boundaries of the known world. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. After a long year at work, I wanted something quiet, somewhere remote where I could disconnect completely. I found a small, isolated cabin online, tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine. The photos showed a modest wooden structure, a stone fireplace, and large windows looking out onto a forested slope. The owners promised it was quiet, with no neighbors for miles. I liked the idea of being completely alone for a while. My plan was simple: pack a week's worth of supplies, bring a few books, and spend some time hiking and just existing in silence. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The last part of the drive was rough, a narrow dirt road full of potholes, bordered by thick pine forests. The GPS barely worked once I turned off the main highway. By the time I reached the cabin, I was relieved to see the small wooden structure waiting at the end of a gravel path. It looked sturdier than I expected, with a chimney that rose above the treeline and a small porch with a creaky wooden swing. The first thing I noticed was how silent it was. Even the wind didn't seem to move through the forest much. The usual rustle of leaves was replaced by a stillness that made me tense. I carried my bags inside and set them on the floor. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and cleaning products. There were a few small rooms: a living room with the fireplace, a modest kitchen, a small bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything was functional, though not luxurious. I unpacked my things and decided to make a quick meal. While cooking, I glanced out the window and noticed the forest pressed close to the cabin on all sides. The trees were tall and dense, their trunks forming thick columns that blocked almost all light from the overcast sky. I shrugged and focused on my food, telling myself the isolation was part of the experience. As night fell, I lit the fireplace and settled into a chair with one of my books. The silence of the forest outside was absolute, almost oppressive. Every small sound inside the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the rustling of my pages, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed amplified against the stillness outside. Around 10 p.m., I finished my book and decided to go to bed. The bedroom was small but comfortable. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and lay down, trying to ignore the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I slept lightly that first night. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized the sound was more deliberate, a soft crunching on the gravel of the driveway. My stomach tightened. I lay still, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, moving closer to the cabin. I sat up slowly and strained to see through the darkness beyond the curtains. I could make out vague shapes in the shadows, but nothing definitive. My first thought was a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match anything I'd ever heard in the forest. I remembered the old hunting rifle in the corner of the living room. I told myself not to panic and quietly got out of bed. Every step on the wooden floor felt unnaturally loud. I reached the living room and carefully aimed the rifle toward the window, checking the scope for any movement. The forest was dark, almost black, and my eyes struggled to adjust. After a few tense minutes, I saw a figure moving slowly through the trees. It was tall, and the way it moved seemed deliberate, not like an animal. My pulse quickened, and I considered calling the police, but the cell signal was weak. One bar, barely enough to make a call, and texting was impossible. I decided to stay where I was, sitting on the floor with the rifle across my lap. The figure stopped just beyond the tree line, standing motionless for a long time. I could feel its gaze, though I couldn't see its face. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, it backed away, disappearing into the darkness. I waited another half hour, but nothing came. Exhausted, I went back to the bedroom and locked the door again, leaving the lights on this time. Sleep was fitful, full of shadows moving just outside my window. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin. They were large, too large to be mine, and they circled the building in a way that suggested someone had been watching. My heart sank. I took photos with my phone, hoping they could serve as evidence if things got worse. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long beams across the forest floor. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that people probably came up the road to hunt or check trails, but the thought didn't comfort me. The footprints were strange. Not only were they large, but they didn't belong to any known shoe or boot. They were strangely wide, almost like someone had worn heavy-duty work boots with soles that left unusual tread patterns. I spent the day avoiding the windows, sticking mostly to the interior. I read, did some chores, and tried to keep my mind busy, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I heard a branch snap, I froze. By evening, I could feel my anxiety growing. I debated leaving, but the road was slippery from recent rain, and I didn't want to drive in the dark on a barely maintained dirt track. I told myself I would wait until morning, then pack and go. That night, the figure returned. I heard it before I saw it, the soft scrape of boots against gravel. I ducked behind the couch, rifle ready. My pulse was racing, hands clammy. The person, or whatever it was, moved slowly around the cabin again. I realized they weren't just outside the windows. There was a sound from the back door, a quiet but deliberate tapping, like someone testing whether it was locked. I held my breath, counting silently. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, almost inaudible murmur of movement, footsteps retreating back toward the tree line. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I examined the cabin and discovered more footprints. This time, they led all the way to the side of the building, stopping abruptly at the tree line. It became clear that someone had been circling the cabin, watching me. My sense of isolation turned into fear. I realized that if the person had been willing to stalk the cabin at night, there was no telling what they might do if I tried to leave or confront them. I decided to create a plan. I barricaded the doors with heavy furniture and nailed pieces of wood across the windows. I dug a small trench near the porch to make it harder for someone to approach unnoticed. I stocked water and food in easily accessible spots, just in case I had to stay barricaded for an extended period. Every small noise made my stomach clench. I realized that hiding was my best chance, not confrontation. Days passed. I stayed inside almost continuously. I rationed food and water, using the fireplace only sparingly to avoid drawing attention. I moved silently, never opening the doors during daylight, only peering cautiously out small gaps in the windows. The figure never came inside, but I saw it frequently at the edge of the trees, standing motionless, watching. Sometimes I thought I glimpsed two figures, though I could never be sure. My supplies dwindled, and so did my confidence. On the fourth night, I heard voices, distant at first, then louder. I realized it was people moving along the forest road, maybe hikers or hunters. I stayed perfectly still, praying they would pass. After an hour, the voices faded. But I realized the stalker must have been nearby because I noticed fresh footprints leading away from the cabin and intersecting with those of the new visitors. Whoever had been watching me now seemed aware of outside activity, which made me even more nervous. I resolved that I needed to leave no matter the risk. I waited for mid-morning when the light was bright, making it less likely for anyone to ambush me unnoticed. I carried the rifle, one hand on the door handle, the other on the stock. My plan was to drive straight down the dirt road and reach the main highway as quickly as possible. As I stepped outside, I froze. Footprints surrounded the cabin on all sides, but no one was in sight. My heart pounded, but I moved quickly, sticking to the center of the path. I could hear the distant hum of a car engine from the main road and knew I had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the highway. The first vehicle that passed slowed when it saw me, and I waved frantically until it stopped. I explained as much as I could, though I still had only one bar of service and shaky voice. The driver called the police while taking me to a nearby town. I learned that similar incidents had happened in the area. Isolated cabins, stalkers who preyed on people seeking solitude. The officers told me the footprints and other signs I'd seen were consistent with known local cases of people following remote cabin visitors, often taking photographs, leaving marks, and sometimes committing theft or violence if someone stayed too long. Weeks later, I returned home, shaken but safe. I never went back to the cabin or the region. I still have nightmares about the silent figure watching me from the trees, but I remind myself that I survived by staying calm, prepared, and patient. I keep a rifle and emergency supplies at home now, more cautious than ever. The experience changed the way I view isolation and nature. There is peace in solitude, but in remote places you have to be aware that danger doesn't always come from the natural world. It sometimes comes from humans who know the terrain and how to hide in it. I never forgot the feeling of being completely alone, yet intensely observed, in that small cabin deep in the forest. It's a memory that lingers vividly. The smell of the damp wood, the oppressive silence, the way shadows moved unnaturally, and the constant awareness that someone, somewhere, was just out of sight, waiting and watching. I learned that fear in such a setting isn't born of the dark or the wind or imagined things. It is born of knowing, with absolute certainty, that another person has the ability to act against you while remaining invisible. That clarity was terrifying, but surviving it taught me the value of preparation, vigilance, and, above all, patience. I emerged from that experience with scars that weren't visible but were deeply etched in my understanding of danger. I had made it through because I acted cautiously, trusted my instincts, and did not let panic dictate my choices. The cabin itself eventually became a memory rather than a destination. I kept the photos of footprints and the old map of the surrounding trails as reminders of what had happened. Occasionally, I replay it in my mind, analyzing every detail, imagining what could have happened if I had been careless. But that analysis always ends the same way. I survived. I learned to respect solitude, yes, but more importantly, I learned to respect the reality that humans can be the most dangerous part of the wilderness. And in that understanding, I found a strange kind of peace. I survived. I left. And for that, I am grateful. I never thought I would end up in a situation like that, stranded in a remote cabin deep in the woods, isolated from the rest of the world, surrounded by darkness that seemed alive. It all started on a late October afternoon. I had been driving for hours along winding mountain roads, the kind where the trees grow so close that their branches arch overhead and form a natural tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine, damp from an early morning drizzle. My plan had been simple: a solo weekend getaway to a cabin I had rented online, somewhere far from the city, to escape the constant noise of life and just be alone with my thoughts. I thought it would be relaxing, a peaceful retreat. I was wrong. I had no idea how wrong. The directions I had printed out were vague. They mentioned landmarks like a large fallen oak and a creek crossing, but nothing precise. My phone signal had already dropped miles back, so I couldn't rely on GPS. I followed the dirt track that snaked up the mountain, its surface slippery with mud. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of old, rusted signs warning about steep drops or washed-out bridges. I ignored them. By the time the sun began to fall behind the mountains, the cabin should have been in sight, but there was nothing, just more forest. Shadows stretched across the road, and every tree seemed taller, denser, darker than the last. I was about to turn back when I spotted it. A small clearing tucked between two ridges. The cabin was there, a log structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was weathered, gray, and rough. Windows were dark and some panes were cracked. A thin wisp of smoke rose lazily from the chimney, suggesting someone had been there recently, or maybe it was an old ember that had never fully died. My first thought was to reconsider, but then I reminded myself that this was exactly what I had been looking for: isolation. I parked the car near a rickety fence and approached the cabin. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, sending up small clouds of dust. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Dust coated the floorboards, and a few cobwebs hung in the corners. I found the fireplace cold and empty, and a small stack of firewood in the corner looked usable but dry only on the surface. There was a table with two chairs, a small bed in the far corner, and an old, heavy wardrobe against the wall. The windows were dirty, but I could see the forest pressing in close outside. I unpacked my bag, leaving only essentials on the bed. My first priority was to get a fire going before night fully descended. As I worked to build the fire, I noticed the silence outside. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had expected, the kind that makes the air feel lighter and cleaner. It was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. No birds chirped, no wind rustled the branches. Even the distant sound of a stream, which I knew was nearby, was gone. I shook the feeling off, blaming it on being alone. Once the fire caught, the warmth and the glow were comforting. Shadows danced along the walls, making the cabin feel both alive and empty at the same time. That first night, I slept poorly. Every creak of the cabin made me startle. A loose board above the door rattled when the wind picked up, and I swore I heard a soft tapping at one of the windows. I told myself it was nothing, branches brushing against the glass, but the unease settled in deep. I woke several times, convinced I had heard footsteps on the wooden floor, but each time there was nothing. The night passed slowly. I watched the orange embers of the fire until they dimmed, finally curling up under a thin blanket, exhausted. Morning didn't bring relief. The forest outside seemed to have changed overnight. The fog that rose from the valleys made the trees appear like strange shapes, dark and distorted. The path I had driven on the previous day looked even more unfamiliar. I realized I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. Only the thick, unmoving trees and the mist that swallowed the ground. I decided to explore the area, hoping to find the creek mentioned in the directions. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen leaves and hidden roots that made each step uncertain. I followed a narrow path through dense undergrowth, using a walking stick to test the ground ahead. After about an hour, I reached a small stream. The water was clear, but the banks were slippery, and the air was damp and cold. I filled my water bottle, drank slowly, and took a moment to breathe. Despite the eeriness, there was a strange beauty to the woods. As I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The path I had come from, the one I had walked through without trouble just an hour ago, now looked unfamiliar. Some trees seemed to have shifted positions, though I knew they hadn't. The landmarks I had noted, an oddly shaped rock, a fallen branch, were gone. Panic started to creep in. I walked faster, but every step seemed to lead me deeper into the forest, not toward the cabin. Hours passed. I circled back repeatedly, only to end up in the same areas. The forest seemed to have a pattern, like a maze designed to trap. Sunlight began to fade again, and the fog thickened. By the time I stumbled back to the cabin, I was soaked in sweat and mud, my legs trembling. The door was still intact, the cabin unchanged, yet the sense of relief was fleeting. I felt watched, as if something had been following me all day. I checked the windows, the perimeter, but saw nothing. That night, I made sure to barricade the door as best I could, piling some old chairs against it. I stayed close to the fireplace, lighting a larger fire. The wind howled outside, making the cabin groan and shudder. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. At some point, I heard it again. Soft tapping, closer now. Not branches. Something deliberate. My heart raced. I grabbed a heavy stick from beside the fireplace and listened. The tapping continued for several minutes, then stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but only silence returned, thick and heavy. Sleep was impossible. I dozed lightly, waking at every creak, every groan of the cabin. At one point, I swore I heard breathing outside the door. I sat up, my hand gripping the stick. The wind was stronger now, rattling the windows, but the sound was irregular, like it was moving closer, then retreating. Hours passed in a blur of fear and tension. By the time morning arrived, I was mentally exhausted, my body trembling from stress and lack of sleep. Morning brought no relief. I needed to leave. I decided to check the car, hoping I could find some sense of direction. I stepped outside, and the fog made the world around me nearly invisible. The car was exactly where I had left it, but the path leading back to the main road was obscured. I tried to remember the turns I had taken, the landmarks, but everything was distorted. For the first time, I realized how completely isolated I was. No phone signal, no passersby, no one within miles. I spent the next day trying to find the main road, marking my path with small piles of stones and broken branches. Every time I thought I had made progress, I would turn a corner and find myself back at the cabin, as if the forest itself was shifting. Hunger and thirst gnawed at me, and the stress made it harder to think clearly. I felt trapped in a place that seemed alive, deliberately keeping me inside its boundaries. By the third day, I was desperate. My supplies were dwindling, and I had not seen another human being. I decided to stay calm and ration my food and water, but sleep became impossible. Every shadow, every movement outside the cabin made me tense. I even considered leaving the cabin at night, trying to navigate by the stars, but the risk of getting lost completely was too high. The forest was dense, uneven, and treacherous. I decided to wait for daylight and move carefully. On the fourth day, I noticed a change in the forest. The fog lifted slightly, revealing faint tire tracks in the mud, old and worn but present. Hope surged. I decided to follow them, reasoning that they might lead to another road or a sign of civilization. I packed my bag, secured my belongings, and left the cabin. The forest was quiet but no longer oppressive. The tracks guided me through thick undergrowth, across small streams, and over fallen logs. Hours passed, and I finally began to see signs of human presence. A broken fence, a discarded bottle, a trail marker nailed to a tree. By late afternoon, I emerged from the dense forest onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me in a physical wave. I could see the sun breaking through the clouds, illuminating the mountains in the distance. I followed the road, and within an hour, I reached a small town. The people there looked at me with concern. My clothes were torn and muddy, my face pale and lined from stress. I explained nothing at first, I just wanted food, water, and a place to rest. Eventually, I recounted my story. The locals listened, some nodding knowingly. They explained that the area where I had rented the cabin was known for confusing trails and poor mapping. Many hikers and visitors had become disoriented, sometimes spending days trying to find their way out. They offered to take me back to my car the next day. Returning to the cabin later, in daylight with guides, I saw the place clearly for the first time. It was as isolated as I had imagined, but the fear that had gripped me now seemed partly in my mind. The tracks, the fog, and the unfamiliar layout of the forest had combined to create a sense of living danger, though no one and nothing had actively harmed me. It was a terrifying ordeal, but ultimately, I had survived. I drove away from the mountains with a new respect for the wilderness, understanding that isolation itself could be as frightening as any predator. The experience stayed with me for years, a constant reminder of how vulnerable one can be in a place that is both beautiful and indifferent. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple at first: escape the noise and chaos of the city, find a quiet cabin somewhere deep in the woods, and spend a week alone with just my thoughts and a small collection of books. I had grown tired of constant notifications, crowded streets, the endless hum of people and traffic. The cabin I found was small, basic, and far enough from any town to guarantee solitude. It was listed online with a few photos that showed a weathered wooden structure surrounded by thick trees, a narrow dirt path leading to it, and a small creek nearby. The description mentioned no electricity, minimal running water, and no cell signal. It was perfect, I thought, for what I needed. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough supplies: canned food, bottled water, a portable stove, a small first aid kit, and some warm clothes. I also brought a flashlight, extra batteries, and a pocket knife for emergencies. The backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The thought of complete isolation was worth it. The drive was long. I left the city in the late morning, taking roads that became narrower and bumpier the further I went. Eventually, the paved road ended, replaced by dirt and gravel that rattled my car and forced me to drive slowly. The trees became taller, older, and more crowded, their branches almost touching across the narrow road. Every so often, I passed a small clearing, a fallen tree, or the remnants of a wooden fence, broken and leaning in strange angles. The deeper I drove, the more I felt the city fade from my mind. It was quiet in a way I had never experienced before. No engines, no distant sirens, not even the faint hum of electricity. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me I was not completely alone. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The light had begun to fade, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked exactly as it had in the photos. Worn but sturdy, with moss growing on the roof and a chimney that looked long and used. The windows were dusty, and the wooden steps leading to the porch creaked under my weight. I parked the car nearby, careful not to leave it too close to the trees, and started unloading my supplies. I took my time, checking the doors, windows, and locks. Everything seemed functional, though aged. The interior smelled faintly of wood, dust, and something earthy I couldn't identify. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the air was cool and damp. The furniture was sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, a worn couch, a bed with a thin mattress, and a few shelves filled with old books and tools. The stove looked usable, though the oven door hung slightly crooked. A small pile of firewood sat in the corner, dry enough to use immediately. Night fell faster than I expected. The darkness outside the cabin was almost complete. I could barely see the trees beyond the porch, their forms blending into the blackness. The creek nearby whispered faintly, its sound oddly calming at first. I lit the flashlight to move around and unpack, arranging my supplies carefully. I found a few matches in a drawer and used them to light a small fire in the stove, feeling the warmth and faint glow spread through the room. I ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread, washing it down with water from my bottles. The silence was overwhelming at first. It wasn't a peaceful silence, exactly. It felt alive. The wind rustled the leaves outside, making long, eerie shadows move across the walls. Somewhere, a branch snapped, and I flinched, realizing how unused I was to total isolation. I went to bed early, hoping to adjust quickly to this new environment. The mattress was thin and uneven, but it was enough to make me sleep. The first night was restless. Every small sound, the creak, wind, snapping branches, even the settling of the cabin, seemed amplified in the dark. I lay awake for hours, trying to tell myself it was nothing, just nature. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something aware of my presence. By the time I finally fell asleep, it was just before dawn. The following days passed slowly, each blending into the next. I established a routine, waking at sunrise, taking short walks along the creek or through the trees, checking my supplies, reading, and preparing meals on the small stove. The isolation was heavier than I anticipated. Without any human contact, even the simplest tasks felt laborious. I started noticing details I would have ignored in the city. The patterns of animal tracks in the mud, the way the wind shifted in the treetops, the distant sounds of birds or something larger moving through the forest. Some mornings, I would wake to find small signs that I was not entirely alone. A broken branch near the cabin, footprints in the soft earth, even a scrap of cloth snagged on a bush that I didn't remember seeing before. I told myself it was probably animals, hikers, or hunters passing nearby, but the unease lingered. On the fourth day, things began to feel more oppressive. A storm was forecast, and by afternoon, heavy clouds rolled in, covering the sky and making the forest darker. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and bending them in strange angles. I stayed inside, reinforcing the windows and doors as best I could, and stacked extra firewood by the stove in case the storm lasted longer than expected. Rain began in the evening, a steady downpour that hammered against the roof and walls. The sound was almost comforting at first, but as darkness fell, it became oppressive. I could hear the water rushing through the creek, louder now, and I wondered if the small embankments near the cabin would hold. The storm intensified, and I couldn't help noticing the way the cabin shuddered under the wind, the way loose shingles rattled against the roof. Every shadow in the room seemed deeper, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I tried to focus on reading, but I kept glancing at the windows, waiting for some sign of trouble. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. Rain pounded so hard that I could barely hear myself think. The wind tore branches from the trees, one of which struck the cabin roof with a heavy crash, sending dust and splinters scattering across the floor. The house shook violently, and for a few terrifying moments, I feared the roof might collapse. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the side of the cabin where the impact had been strongest. A large branch had broken through the gutter and left a dent in the roof, but thankfully, the structure seemed intact. The thought that the forest outside could be this violent, this destructive, unnerved me. I spent the next hours sitting near the stove, flashlight in hand, watching the rain lash the cabin and listening to the forest rage around me. I barely slept. When the storm finally subsided the next morning, I stepped outside to inspect the damage. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and broken wood. Trees had fallen, their roots ripped from the soil, blocking the small path that led to the main road. The creek had swelled, spilling over its banks in several places, and the surrounding forest was littered with debris. The cabin had held, but barely. I realized then just how isolated I truly was. If the weather got worse, or if something happened to me here, help could be days away. After the storm, the cabin felt different. The forest seemed closer, more menacing, as if it had taken a small part of the cabin in its fury. I found it difficult to leave the interior, even for food or water. My mind played tricks on me. I would hear movements in the trees, fleeting shadows passing the windows, or sudden snapping sounds that made my heart leap. At first, I blamed fatigue and isolation, but the unease was persistent. I began to notice small things. The smell of smoke even when the stove wasn't lit, the floorboards near the door slightly warped as if someone had stepped there, marks in the mud outside that weren't from my shoes. It became clear to me that someone or something had been near the cabin during the storm. I didn't hear voices or see people, but the evidence was subtle and undeniable. Someone had approached, maybe taking advantage of the chaos. My first instinct was panic. I considered leaving immediately, but the path to the main road was blocked by fallen trees and debris. The storm had effectively cut me off. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin as best as I could. I checked the doors, nailed loose boards, and created improvised barriers with furniture. I also armed myself with the pocket knife and a few large pieces of firewood. Even small noises made me jump. A branch scraping the roof, a rock falling near the creek, the distant caw of a crow. My imagination ran wild, but I forced myself to stay logical. If someone was nearby, I needed to be prepared. That night, I left a small fire burning in the stove and sat near it, listening intently to the forest. I could hear faint footsteps outside, then silence, then more movement. My heart raced, but I stayed calm, reminding myself that I was not defenseless. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait for help to come to me. I needed a plan. I spent hours examining the path to the main road, finding gaps between fallen branches and weakened soil that I could navigate. I gathered as many supplies as I could carry in my backpack. Food, water, the first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and the knife. I made sure to leave the cabin tidy and organized, in case I had to return. By mid-afternoon, I set out. The forest was quiet but not peaceful. Every step was slow and careful, avoiding broken branches, mud, and unstable ground. I constantly looked around, aware that someone could be following me, though I never saw anyone. The forest seemed endless, the path to civilization long and obscured. Hours passed, and fatigue began to set in. My legs ached, and my backpack felt heavier with every step. By nightfall, I realized I needed shelter, even if it was only temporary. I found a small natural clearing with a shallow overhang from a rocky ledge. I set down my backpack, used some branches to create a makeshift cover, and tried to sleep, exhausted and alert at the same time. The following day, I resumed my journey early. My energy was low, but I focused on one goal, the main road. By midday, I spotted the faint outline of a dirt road through the trees. Relief surged through me. I moved faster, adrenaline pushing me forward. Eventually, I reached the road. It was empty, silent, and dusty, but it was a road, and that meant signs of civilization were near. I walked along it until I saw a small farmhouse in the distance. I waved my arms, shouting, and eventually, someone emerged from the house. They gave me water, called the local authorities, and helped me get back to safety. When I finally returned home, I was exhausted, dirty, and mentally drained. But I had survived. The experience left me wary, but also proud. I had underestimated the isolation and the vulnerability it brought. I realized that nature alone was enough to unsettle and endanger a person, and that isolation could magnify fear in ways I had never imagined. The cabin was just a place, but being alone there, cut off from the world, made me see how fragile human security could be. I later learned that during the storm, a small group of local scavengers had moved through the forest, searching for abandoned cabins and anything left behind. The footprints and broken branches I had noticed were theirs. They hadn't harmed me, probably because I stayed hidden, but the thought of encountering them was enough to make my blood run cold. It was a sharp lesson in vigilance and the dangers of isolation in remote areas. In the end, the trip had given me more than solitude. It had given me respect for the power of nature, for the unpredictability of isolation, and for the strength required to survive with only oneself. The cabin, the forest, the storm, and the unknown presence outside, all of it left a mark on me that I would never forget. I learned that fear is not always about what you imagine. It is often about what is real and what could be in a world where help is not guaranteed. I also learned the importance of preparation, careful observation, and staying calm under pressure. By the time I returned to the city, I carried with me not just memories, but a deeper understanding of my own resilience and the quiet dangers of the wilderness. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After weeks of endless work, deadlines, and the constant buzz of city life, the idea of a solitary cabin tucked deep in the forest felt like a dream. I had packed carefully, making sure I had everything I might need. Food for 2 days, water, warm clothes, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and a hatchet for chopping firewood. I had even packed a journal, thinking I might document the quiet of the woods in ways I never could in the city. It all seemed so simple, so safe. The kind of trip that people did all the time, alone or with friends, and came back with stories about peace, quiet, and the beauty of the wilderness. I had found the cabin online, a small, rustic place that was advertised as remote and peaceful, surrounded by thick forest and complete privacy. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin with a porch, a stone fireplace, and a small creek running nearby. The reviews mentioned birds, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the clear night sky. Nothing warned me about the realities of isolation in the forest, the kind of isolation that isn't charming or peaceful. It's raw, unsettling, and sometimes dangerous in ways you don't expect. The drive out there was long. As I left the city, the houses thinned out, replaced by open fields and then dense trees. I felt a familiar sense of excitement mixed with relief. No traffic, no people, no responsibilities. Just me, the forest, and the cabin waiting at the end of the dirt road. I reached the final turn as the sun was beginning to lower behind the hills, casting long shadows that made the trees look taller, darker, and more imposing. The cabin came into view, and I felt a brief rush of satisfaction. It was exactly as pictured. Wood darkened with age, a stone chimney, a small porch with a swing. I parked, stepped out, and breathed in the air, sharp, clean, cold. The forest smelled of pine, earth, and damp leaves. Birds chirped, and the creek burbled quietly behind the cabin. I felt a calm wash over me as I pulled my backpack from the car. This was going to be perfect. I spent the first hour unpacking, organizing my things, and exploring the cabin. Inside, it was small but comfortable. A single room with a bed, a kitchen area with a sink and a small fridge, and the fireplace. The windows had thick wooden frames and simple curtains. I checked everything, doors locked, windows latched. It all seemed secure. I lit a fire in the fireplace, stacked some wood beside it, and made myself a simple meal from the canned food I had brought. As night fell, the forest changed. The birds were silent. The creek's sound grew sharper in the quiet. Shadows moved oddly among the trees, shapes that weren't really shapes but your mind trying to make sense of the darkness. I sat by the fire, reading my journal, making notes about the day, the forest, the cabin. The night was cold, so I added more wood. The fire crackled and popped, throwing light against the walls. That's when I first noticed it, a faint rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon, a deer, something small. But the sound was deliberate, slow, circling the cabin. I froze, trying to listen. The rustling stopped. I told myself it was nothing. The forest was full of sounds at night. My imagination was working overtime. Still, I kept the hatchet near me. Hours passed, and I eventually fell asleep, the fire dying down to embers. When I woke, it was early morning. The sun was low, filtering through the trees in long beams. I checked outside. Nothing seemed amiss. Tracks in the dirt suggested deer had come close, but no human footprints. I shook off the tension from the night and started my day with coffee heated on a small camping stove. The second day began with more exploration. I followed a small trail behind the cabin, deeper into the woods, discovering the creek up close. Rocks slick with moss, the air humid and thick with the smell of earth. I took photos with my phone, noting the quiet, the colors, the way the light touched the leaves. I found a small clearing, perfect for setting up a fire if I wanted to cook outside. The forest was beautiful, peaceful, for the moment. The night of the second day is when things began to feel wrong. I had eaten early, organized my supplies, and spent the afternoon chopping firewood. By evening, the light was fading, and the forest became a gray blur. I lit the fire again, adding logs carefully, stacking them so it would burn all night if needed. That's when I heard it more clearly. Not rustling this time, but movement, a crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze, staring into the darkened woods. The sound stopped and started again. It didn't seem like a deer this time. Too slow, too heavy. I felt my heart race. I checked all the doors and windows. Locked, latched, secure. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I turned off all the lights, letting only the fire glow. The shadows danced, and the movement outside became more noticeable. A silhouette passed among the trees. Too tall for a deer, too human. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Could it be someone hiking? Someone lost? But the nearest road was miles away. No one should be here. The night grew colder. I kept the fireplace burning and grabbed my phone. No signal. I tried again and again. Nothing. I realized I was truly alone. The silhouette came closer. I could see it clearly now, tall, moving with slow, careful steps, stopping as if listening. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever it was had found me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, hatchet in hand, eyes straining in the dark. Every snap of a branch made me jump. Every movement outside made my heart thud. I thought about staying awake until sunrise, but the cold and exhaustion were wearing me down. Still, I dared not sleep. By morning, the figure was gone. I checked outside. Footprints. Human. Barefoot. Large. Circling the cabin. Stopping near the door, then leading back into the trees. Panic rose. Someone had been there, close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to watch me all night. My instincts screamed to leave. I gathered my things quickly, leaving everything except what I could carry. The drive back was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow on the side of the road made me glance in the rearview mirror. I kept thinking about the cabin, the figure, how close it had been. By the time I reached the highway, I felt almost numb with relief. In the days that followed, I contacted the property owner. They were shocked but confirmed that people sometimes came to the area for target practice or illegal camping. They assured me the forest was mostly safe, but they warned me about the remoteness and the occasional intruder. I realized how naive I had been, thinking isolation was harmless. I returned home with a new understanding of fear and caution. The experience stayed with me for months, haunting me in quiet moments. I learned to respect solitude in the wilderness, to plan for unexpected dangers, and to never underestimate how alone one can feel when surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of footsteps that aren't yours. The cabin itself remained as advertised. Rustic, peaceful, quiet, but I could never return. Not with the memory of that figure, slow, deliberate, and watching. My life went back to normal, but the fear I felt was permanent. It was real, grounded, and tangible, unlike the stories people tell about ghosts or monsters. Real danger doesn't wear costumes. It comes silently, steps around your cabin, and vanishes into the trees, leaving only fear in its wake. I never shared the location publicly. No one should stumble into that kind of danger unprepared. I bought a small portable security system, and whenever I camped, I made sure someone knew exactly where I was. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. That night taught me a lesson I could never forget. Isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifyingly real. Even years later, when I close my eyes at night, I can hear the faint crunch of leaves outside the cabin. It's a memory that will never fade. The sound of being truly alone, truly watched, with no one to save you but yourself. And in a way, that memory changed me. It made me more careful, more aware, and more appreciative of the safety and routine of everyday life. The forest may be peaceful, but it can also be cruel, quiet, and unforgiving. I learned that the hard way. I had been planning the trip for months, searching for a cabin far enough into the wilderness that I could escape the noise of the city and spend a few days completely alone. I wanted silence, space, and the kind of peace that comes from being surrounded only by trees and the occasional sound of birds or wind. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I craved it. The online listings had all been clear, but the one that caught my attention had a small wooden cabin, far off the nearest road, accessible only by a narrow dirt trail that wound through the forest. It was advertised as rustic, cozy, and secluded. It was exactly what I wanted. I packed my car with supplies. Enough food for several days, a large water jug, camping gear, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and my camera. I drove for hours through winding roads, past towns that seemed more like clusters of old wooden houses than anything else. And eventually I reached the dirt trail that led into the forest. The GPS signal was already weak, but I had a printout of the directions just in case. The trail was narrow, uneven, and covered in fallen leaves that made it slippery. My car barely fit through some parts, and I had to inch forward slowly. I passed a few signs warning about the terrain, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to hiking and being careful, so I didn't see any danger in getting there. The trees grew thick and tall on both sides, forming a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. The forest felt quiet in a way that made me tense. Not frightening yet, just alive in its own way. The deeper I drove, the more I felt that isolation settle over me like a heavy blanket. When I finally reached the cabin, it was even smaller than I had imagined. A single-story wooden structure with a small porch and a stone chimney. There were signs of previous visitors. Footprints in the dirt, a few empty beer cans near the edge of the property, and a fire pit with partially burned logs. I parked the car on a flat area near the cabin and got out to stretch. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and a bird calling somewhere in the distance. I could hear a faint stream somewhere nearby, though I couldn't see it yet. The cabin itself was basic. A small living area with a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a bed in the corner. There was a tiny bathroom with a cold water sink and a shower, and an old, creaky door that led to a small storage area. I dropped my backpack inside and walked around the cabin, inspecting it carefully. Everything seemed intact. The windows were solid, though some had small cracks. The wood smelled of age and dampness. I felt a slight chill despite the warm sun outside. I tried not to think about it and focused on unpacking and setting up my small supplies. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore the immediate area around the cabin. The trail continued past the cabin into the woods, and I thought I might follow it a little to get a sense of my surroundings. The trees were dense, the ground uneven, and the air thick with the scent of moss and wet soil. Birds occasionally took flight, startling me, and I realized that even in the middle of the day, the forest was darker than I expected. I walked for nearly an hour, taking careful steps, noting landmarks, and listening for any unusual sounds. There was nothing immediately threatening, but the deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. No distant cars, no voices, just the wind and my own footsteps. It was a comforting kind of quiet at first, but eventually it started to feel heavy. I turned back to the cabin, but when I glanced in the direction I thought it was, I realized the trail I had been following twisted in ways that made it hard to remember exactly where I came from. I paused, trying to orient myself, and that's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, listening. The footsteps didn't match mine. They were soft, deliberate, slow. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound was distinctly human. My heart started to race, and I quickly turned, expecting to see someone on the trail. There was nothing. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no one. Only shadows and the occasional movement of leaves. I picked up my pace and started walking back toward the cabin. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was low, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. Everything was as I had left it. My mind tried to rationalize the footsteps. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I set up a small fire in the pit, hoping the smoke and light would make me feel safer, and prepared a simple dinner. Night fell quickly. The forest transformed entirely. The shadows deepened, the wind shifted, and strange noises emerged. Branches snapping, the distant call of an animal, the rustle of leaves. I kept a flashlight close and a hatchet on the table. Every sound made me tense. At some point, I realized the footsteps had returned, this time closer, circling the cabin. I moved quietly, checking every window and listening. My stomach nodded. Whoever or whatever it was patient. It was waiting, watching. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the small stove trying to keep warm and listened. Hours passed. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement outside, shadows flitting just beyond the light of my small fire. I considered leaving, but the thought of walking the trail in total darkness terrified me. I kept the door locked and the windows covered. The footsteps didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. The next morning, I resolved to leave. I packed quickly, throwing my things into my backpack, and headed to the car. The trail looked different in daylight. The trees that had seemed so close together the day before now looked even denser. I heard the footsteps again, faint, following me. My pace quickened. I reached the car, unlocked it, and started the engine. Relief surged as I saw the edge of the dirt trail leading back toward the main road. I drove cautiously, keeping an eye on the forest. Every rustle, every shadow made my heart race. I thought about stopping and calling someone, but cell service was non-existent. The dirt trail was rough, narrow, and winding. Several times I had to back up to get around fallen trees or mud pits. I kept thinking I could hear someone, or something, moving just out of sight. After nearly 2 hours, I finally reached the paved road. The forest thinned, and the city noises began to filter through. Relief washed over me. I stopped at a gas station, called my friend, and recounted what happened. They didn't fully understand, but that didn't matter. I just wanted the safety of people around me, lights and traffic. Later, I thought about what had happened at the cabin. There were no ghosts, no monsters, no fairy tales. Just someone following me, hidden in the woods. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easily someone could have taken advantage of my isolation. I reported it to the local authorities and gave them the cabin location and trail details. They said they would investigate, but there was little they could do without more evidence. Weeks later, I returned to the area with a group of rangers. They walked the trail, inspected the cabin, and found subtle signs. Footprints that didn't match mine, broken branches at eye level, and shallow dug pits around the cabin where someone had hidden. They told me it wasn't uncommon for people to use abandoned or secluded cabins for illegal purposes. Squatters, drug users, thieves. They assured me that the cabin would be monitored and the area would be patrolled more frequently. I never went back to that cabin alone. I still hike, but I learned to respect the wilderness in a different way, to never assume isolation is safety. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me more aware, more careful, and more appreciative of the ordinary safety of roads, towns, and people. I kept a journal of the events, documenting every detail I could remember. The sounds, the layout, the fear that had filled me. I needed to remember so that I would never forget how fragile safety can be when alone in the woods. The memory stayed with me for years, a reminder of how real danger can be in a place that seems peaceful, how a quiet forest can hide unseen eyes, and how important it is to prepare for every possibility. I often revisited the story in my mind, each time adding the small details I had initially overlooked. The pattern of footprints, the slight differences in the wind, the subtle changes in shadow as the sun moved across the trees. Those details made it terrifyingly real, and they made me grateful for the day I escaped without harm. In the end, I realized that the good ending wasn't just that I survived. It was that I learned something essential about myself, my limits, and the reality of isolation. I learned to plan better, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate the world around me. The cabin remained, silent and empty, but the forest around it no longer seemed peaceful to me. It was alive, unpredictable, and full of dangers that were very real. And I would never take the quiet of isolation for granted again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long year of work, the constant noise of the city, and the suffocating routine, I craved isolation. The cabin I rented was far in the northern woods, a small, weathered structure built of rough timber and old stone. It sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The map I found online was vague, and my GPS was unreliable once I got deeper into the forest, but that was exactly what I wanted. No interruptions, no people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The drive out was long and nerve-wracking. The roads became dirt tracks, narrow and bumpy, lined with towering pine and birch trees that seemed to close in around the car. Every so often, I would catch movement in the trees, branches swaying, shadows shifting, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or a deer. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, throwing long, orange streaks through the forest. The cabin looked small and fragile against the darkening woods, but it had an old charm I found comforting. Inside, it was rustic but functional. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, a table and 2 beds. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. The first thing I did was check the stove and the fireplace. The previous renter had left some firewood, and I stacked it neatly, thinking about how cold the night could get. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup, bread, and coffee, and ate while staring out the window at the forest. The sun disappeared, and soon everything outside became a blur of dark shapes. The first night was uneventful, though the sounds of the forest were louder than I expected. The wind rustled the trees, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. I had brought a flashlight, but I didn't need it yet. I fell asleep easily, the fatigue of the drive catching up with me. Morning came with mist hanging low in the forest. I stepped outside to get water from the nearby stream, appreciating the quiet. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. The cabin felt safe even if it was small and isolated. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area, noting a small path that led deeper into the woods. I didn't go far, just enough to mark the area mentally. On the second day, things began to feel slightly off. I had woken early to make coffee, and the morning was unusually silent. No birds sang, no squirrels darted about. Even the wind felt subdued. While chopping some firewood, I noticed a large set of footprints in the soft earth near the edge of the clearing. They were big, too big for any deer or bear I was familiar with. The print seemed human in shape but oddly long and wide. I stared at it for several minutes, my stomach tightening. There was no sign of anyone else around the cabin, and the tracks didn't appear to continue toward the cabin. Still, a flicker of unease began to creep in. I told myself it was probably a hunter, or maybe someone who had passed through days ago. The afternoon brought more of that same uneasy feeling. While gathering water from the stream, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Branches snapping, shadows shifting between the trees. Every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. By evening, my nerves were taut. I checked the locks on the cabin doors and windows repeatedly, though they were sturdy old latches. The forest around me seemed different at night. Deeper, darker, almost alive. On the third day, I woke to a strange sound. It was subtle at first, like something being dragged across the ground. I froze, listening. It came from outside the cabin, circling around the clearing. My mind raced through possibilities. A wild animal, a falling branch, a hunter. But the sound repeated, slow and deliberate, like footsteps dragging something heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. I tried to brush it off as imagination, but the sound had definitely existed. I spent the day more alert than before. I avoided the path I had marked, staying close to the cabin. In the late afternoon, I noticed something else. A tree near the cabin had marks on it. Not claw marks, but deep gouges, as if someone had tried to carve something into the bark. I had never seen this kind of mark before. My unease turned into fear, though I tried to stay calm. I double-checked the firewood, ensuring I had enough to stay warm and to signal if necessary. Night fell, and with it, a suffocating darkness. The wind had picked up, rattling the roof and windows. Shadows from the trees stretched across the cabin walls. I could hear distant noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But now there was something else. Low, almost inaudible groaning noises, like someone walking slowly through thick brush. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, listening. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow move across the window. My heart raced. I reminded myself the cabin was in the middle of nowhere, that there was probably nothing there, that fear was just playing tricks on me. The fourth day was the worst. I woke to find fresh footprints in the soft dirt outside the cabin. They were large, human-shaped, and seemed to circle the cabin. Not just one set, but multiple, overlapping. Panic settled in my chest like a stone. Whoever or whatever was out there knew the cabin, had been watching. I considered leaving immediately, but my car was far down the track, and leaving meant moving through dense forest that I could not navigate safely without knowing the terrain. I decided to stay inside, barricade the doors, and wait until I could assess the situation in daylight. During that day, I stayed mostly inside, moving only when necessary. I noticed the firewood stack had been disturbed slightly, though nothing was missing. Every time I looked outside, shadows seemed to linger just beyond the clearing, as if waiting. My anxiety escalated. I tried to focus on practical things, cooking, cleaning, preparing for the night, but everything felt oppressive. Night came again, darker than before. I had secured every window and door as best as I could. The sounds outside were relentless. Footsteps circled, scraping, shuffling, slow and patient. At one point, I heard a branch snap unusually close. My flashlight illuminated nothing beyond the edge of the clearing, but I knew something was there. I stayed crouched by the window for what felt like hours, watching, listening. The shadow never moved too far, always just out of reach. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had been happening. The footprints could have been from hunters or locals, the noises from wildlife. But the deliberate nature of the disturbances, the repeated circling of the cabin, made that explanation feel weak. I decided to leave the cabin immediately. I packed quickly, moving silently so as not to attract attention. I left the cabin in the early morning light, moving along the dirt track toward the main road. The forest seemed different during the day. Trees that had been menacing at night were now ordinary. Still, I felt eyes on me. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I kept my phone ready, hoping for a signal, though I knew it was unlikely. Hours passed, the track winding endlessly, until finally, I reached a point where the forest thinned and the road reappeared. My car was just ahead, parked exactly where I had left it, untouched. Relief washed over me. I drove straight to the nearest town, pulling into a gas station, hands shaking, trying to steady my breath. In the days that followed, I told myself I had imagined much of it. Stress, isolation, fear, it could warp perception. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. I couldn't explain the footprints, the sounds, the marks on the tree near the cabin. I never went back. Months later, I read a local news article about hikers in the same forest reporting similar experiences. Footprints near cabins, strange noises at night, the feeling of being watched. Some had fled without explanation. Others had called authorities. The police found signs of trespassing, but no suspects were ever caught. It seemed that the forest itself, dense and remote, allowed someone, or a few people, to move unnoticed, observing from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to instill fear. I realized, in hindsight, that my instincts had been correct. The danger was real, human, and patient. It was not supernatural. It was just someone, or more than one person, using the isolation of the forest to their advantage. That knowledge stayed with me for years, a constant reminder that isolation can be a weapon, that the wilderness is beautiful but unforgiving, and that some fear comes not from the dark, but from the creatures who thrive within it. Now, whenever I see a remote cabin listing, I hesitate. The memory of circling footprints, scraping branches, and deliberate shadows is etched into my mind. I understand the need to respect the wilderness, to never assume safety in isolation, and to always consider that other humans may be watching, waiting, and knowing that fear is as potent as any weapon. I never stayed in a cabin alone again, not even near the edge of a small town. And even when I camped in controlled areas with people nearby, I carried a constant vigilance. The experience changed me. I had learned that fear, when grounded in reality, can be more terrifying than any story. And that realization, though painful, had saved me from something far worse. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin in the woods had something about it that felt necessary, though I could not explain why. Life in the city had become heavy and draining, a constant cloud of noise and obligations that left me tense and tired. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted to feel the weight of my own mind without the interference of people, traffic, or the endless buzzing of notifications. I thought I was prepared. I thought I knew what solitude meant. I was wrong. I drove out in the late afternoon, the sky a flat gray, clouds heavy and low, the kind that pressed down on the trees and hills, making everything seem smaller, muted, and quieter than usual. My route took me out of the city, through a winding stretch of highway bordered by thick forest. I had studied the maps carefully and even printed out old topographical maps, highlighting dirt roads and forest tracks. My GPS worked only sporadically this far out, and I liked it that way. I wanted to be disconnected. The last few miles were rough. The paved road ended, replaced by gravel and then a narrow dirt path that dipped into the forest. My car, though not a 4x4, handled it with slow, careful turns. Each bump reminded me how far from civilization I was. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a sudden, jarring mix of relief and unease. It was small and wooden, nestled among tall pines, the roof darkened with age. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, which suggested it was recently used, but everything else about it was quiet. No signs of people, no footprints other than mine and the faint tracks of deer or other animals. I parked and got out. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for this time of year. It carried the smell of wet earth, pine, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. I carried my backpack, a bundle of firewood, and my supplies toward the cabin. The door was unlocked, or at least unlatched, and it creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dust. I could see the faint remnants of someone's life. A stack of magazines, a jar of matches, an old kettle on the stove. It looked abandoned, yet cared for. I set down my things and took a long look around. The cabin had a single room that functioned as a living area, a small kitchen space, and a lofted area for sleeping. Windows were few, letting in only the fading daylight, and outside the trees loomed close, swaying softly in the wind. The place had a kind of quiet energy, the way old wood seems to hold the memory of every person who touched it. I set about preparing for the night. I laid down my sleeping bag on the loft, stacked wood by the stove, and lit a small fire. The warmth was immediate, a soft golden glow that pushed back against the growing darkness outside. I prepared a simple meal of canned beans and bread, eating slowly, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves and branches outside. By the time I had cleaned up, the sun was gone, and the forest had turned a deep, dark green-black. Shadows clung to the trees and stretched across the cabin's walls through the small windows. At first, the darkness was comforting, felt safe, enveloping. But as the night deepened, the forest began to feel alive in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every sound was amplified: the snap of a twig, the distant call of an animal, the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, a slow, deliberate movement that made my stomach knot. But when I checked, nothing was there. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a deer brushing against the wood. Still, the unease settled in my chest like a stone. Sleep came slowly. I lay on the loft, listening to the fire crackle and the forest breathe. I tried to focus on the small, mundane things: the warmth of the blanket, the smell of the wood, the rhythm of my own breathing. But every few minutes, I would catch a noise that was too deliberate, too sharp to be random. Sometimes it was outside the window, just a shadow moving across the glass. Sometimes it was a scraping sound from the floor below, soft but unmistakable. I woke several times that night, each time convinced I had heard something. Once, I even opened my eyes to see a shadow standing at the edge of the loft, just beyond the firelight, indistinct. But there, my heart stopped. I froze, listening. Nothing moved. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Cabin noises, tree branches, the mind playing tricks in the dark. Morning came eventually, though not easily. Light filtered through the trees in muted gray streams. I felt the night in my bones, the tightness in my chest, the tremor in my hands. I tried to shake it off with a long stretch, a sip of cold water, and a deep breath. I reminded myself that I was alone, that no one had been here, that fear had a way of magnifying small things into monsters. I decided to go for a walk. I needed to move, to see the forest in daylight, to reassure myself. I followed a faint trail behind the cabin. It was overgrown, almost invisible, the kind of trail that only appeared when someone walked it regularly. Branches scraped against my jacket, and the ground was soft and damp beneath my boots. Birds called from the trees, a few squirrels darted across the trail, and for a while, I felt a sense of calm returning. Then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, large, boot-shaped, unlike any deer or animal. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin and then continued past it, into the denser trees. My stomach sank. I knew I hadn't been followed, hadn't seen anyone. The prints were too deliberate, too human. My mind raced with possibilities: hunters, poachers, someone living in the woods. I debated going back to the cabin, but curiosity and a dull sense of duty pushed me forward. I followed the trail, careful, silent, trying to see where it led. The trail twisted through thick underbrush and twisted roots, taking me deeper into the forest than I realized. My boots slipped in the mud, my hands scratched by branches. I began to feel the oppressive isolation again, the way the trees seemed to lean in, watching, whispering. The footprints led to a small clearing, and there I saw a makeshift camp. A tarp hung between two trees, a small fire pit smoldered with ashes, and there were signs of recent activity. Discarded cans, footprints, a pair of gloves. I realized I was not alone in these woods. Someone had been here, watching, maybe waiting. The thought made my skin crawl. I scanned the area carefully, looking for movement. Nothing, just the dense forest and the faint, fading smell of smoke. I made a quick decision to head back, retracing my steps carefully, making mental notes of every sound. Returning to the cabin felt different. The forest had changed. Shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. My pace quickened, heart pounding. I reached the cabin, checked the perimeter, and locked the door, though I knew the lock was flimsy at best. I sat down on the floor, back against the wall, trying to calm myself. That night was worse than the first. Every sound became amplified. The wind, the trees, even the creaking of the cabin floor felt threatening. I refused to sleep, instead keeping a fire going, a knife beside me, listening and waiting. Hours passed, hours that felt like days. At one point, I thought I heard someone scratching at the door, but when I went to check, there was nothing. My mind began to fray. Morning brought some relief, but also resolve. I packed what I could carry, decided I would leave. I did not need silence anymore. I needed safety. I gathered my things, checked the car, and started the engine. The forest seemed to resist me, branches reaching across the dirt road, roots making the car jolt. But I pushed on, slowly, carefully, until I reached the gravel road. Driving back toward the highway, the fear began to ebb, replaced with exhaustion and relief. I looked in the rearview mirror occasionally, half expecting someone to emerge from the trees, but there was no one. Just the road, the forest, and the sense of being alive, fragile, and human. I reached civilization eventually. The familiar sights, the gas station, the neon signs, the hum of traffic, were almost painful in their normalcy. I pulled into a small diner, sat down with a cup of coffee, and let myself breathe. I was tired, shaken, but safe. I would return to the cabin eventually, perhaps, but not alone, not unprepared. The woods had taught me something essential. Solitude can be dangerous, even when no one is there, and fear is a living thing that thrives on uncertainty. The experience stayed with me. I kept thinking about the footprints, the makeshift camp, the way the forest seemed to watch. I never saw anyone, never heard anyone directly, but I knew I wasn't alone. The memory of that first night, the shadows at the edge of the loft, the scraping sounds, and the oppressive silence of the forest stayed with me for months. It changed the way I thought about being alone, about trust, and about how carefully we take for granted the safety of our own spaces. Eventually, I returned to the woods, but never to that cabin. I made sure to go with others, to carry communication devices, to let people know where I was. The fear had not left me entirely, but it had become something I respected, something that reminded me that nature and people are unpredictable, that even the quietest places can hold danger, that sometimes the most terrifying thing is not a person or an animal, but the unknown, the possibilities, and the knowledge that someone or something may have been watching you, waiting, just out of sight. I keep thinking about the cabin sometimes, about the way it looked at night, about the silence and the footprints. I know I will never forget it, and I know that some places are not meant for solitude, at least not without caution. The woods are patient. They watch, they wait, and they are unforgiving if you underestimate them. It started as a trip I thought would be simple. I had been driving for hours on narrow, winding roads through dense forests, the kind that block out the sun and make the sky seem like a dim gray ceiling. The GPS had been inconsistent, flipping between recalculating and showing vague lines that led deeper into nothing but wilderness. I had packed enough food, water, and supplies for a weekend getaway, but even as I approached the cabin, I felt a tension in the air I couldn't explain. The cabin itself looked smaller than I had imagined from the pictures online. It was old, made of dark, weathered wood with a slanted roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dusty, and the glass had a faint ripple from age, as though every pane had been pressed by time. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the air inside smelled of cold wood and dampness, with a hint of something metallic that I couldn't immediately place. I dropped my bag near the doorway and walked through the main room. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A worn-out sofa, a wooden table with peeling varnish, a single chair, and a fireplace with cold ashes. There were cupboards along the wall, but they looked like they hadn't been opened in months. The first thing I did was check the cabin systems. The electricity worked, but only intermittently. The lights flickered when I turned them on, and the ceiling fan wobbled slightly. The faucet ran, but the water smelled faintly of rust. The stove appeared functional, though I didn't plan on using it immediately. Outside, the forest pressed close, tall pines and oaks leaning toward the cabin like silent sentinels. Birds were scarce, and the only sounds were the occasional snap of a branch in the distance or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I decided to settle in and organize my supplies. I unpacked my food into the cupboards, stacked firewood near the fireplace, and set up my sleeping bag in a corner of the room. By the time I was done, the sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the cabin floor. The light outside dimmed quickly. In the forest, darkness doesn't come gradually. It swallows everything at once. I lit a lantern and moved cautiously around, noticing details I hadn't seen in the daylight. The floorboards creaked under my weight in irregular patterns, some giving way slightly when I stepped on them. The walls bore old nails and hooks, as though previous occupants had left their mark decades ago. Dust clung to corners, and in the fireplace, the soot had hardened into blackened layers. I wanted to start a fire to warm the cabin, so I gathered kindling from the woodpile outside. As I struck matches and coaxed the fire to life, a sudden noise made me freeze. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old cabin or the wind through the trees. It was a dull, repetitive thump, like something heavy hitting wood. I stopped moving and listened, straining my ears. There it was again, slow and deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. My heart started racing. I told myself it could be a branch hitting the wall outside, or perhaps an animal. The cabin was old and the forest dense. Noises like that weren't unusual, but it didn't sound like the wind or a branch. It was steady, rhythmic, almost like deliberate footsteps. I moved to the window and peered outside, lantern in hand. The forest was dark and impenetrable. I couldn't see anything moving. The fire flickered behind me, throwing shadows on the walls, and I realized how isolated I truly was. There were no neighbors within miles, no other cabins nearby. Even my phone had only a faint signal, barely enough to send a text, though I hadn't tried calling. I tried to dismiss the noise, attributing it to my imagination. I sat by the fire and ate some of the food I had brought, all the while keeping my eyes on the shadows in the room. Every time the wind rattled the trees outside, I flinched. At one point, I thought I saw something at the edge of the clearing, just a dark shape moving quickly behind the trees. But when I looked again, it was gone. The rational part of my mind told me it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the fire or the fading sun. But the part that couldn't shake the feeling of being watched tightened in my chest. Night fully fell. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, and I fed it small sticks to keep it alive. The thumping sound returned, softer this time, irregular, coming from outside now. I considered going out to see what it was, but a deep instinct held me back. The forest was dark, and stepping outside meant losing all visibility. I couldn't see what might be there, and even with a flashlight, I would be a moving target. Instead, I checked the doors and windows. Everything was latched, though the door frame looked warped. I wedged a chair against it just in case. Hours passed. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it faint snapping sounds. At some point, I realized the thumping had stopped, but now there were different noises. Scratching at the door, faint shuffling outside the windows. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? Bears, perhaps, or raccoons looking for food? The sound was too large, too persistent to be small creatures. I had brought a hunting knife for emergencies, but I knew it would be useless if something large tried to break in. I considered leaving, driving back down the winding roads in the dark, but the thought of navigating those forest roads without light terrified me. I stayed by the fire, knife in hand, listening, barely breathing, as the cabin seemed to shrink around me with every sound. Around 3 a.m., I noticed another shift. The noises outside stopped entirely, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but heavy, almost suffocating. I strained my ears, and then I heard it. A faint voice, muffled, coming from the direction of the forest. It wasn't clear words, just low tones, like someone speaking in a calm, measured manner, but from far away. I froze. No one should be there. I checked my phone again. There was still a faint signal, enough to call for help if I could find it. I debated leaving the cabin to meet whoever or whatever it was, but fear kept me rooted to the floor. The morning brought light, and with it a cautious sense of relief. Outside, there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been near the cabin. I walked the perimeter, checking the trees and underbrush, but it looked untouched. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that the mind plays tricks at night when one is alone. Still, the fear lingered, a tight knot that didn't loosen even as the sun climbed higher. Over the next day, I took stock of everything. The cabin was intact, the doors secure, and nothing seemed out of place. I realized the noises had been caused by a combination of environmental factors: wind, branches, small animals, and the natural acoustics of the clearing. The fear had been as much a product of my isolation and imagination as anything tangible. I strengthened the door with extra logs and cleared some of the surrounding brush so I could see any movement more clearly. I also marked the trees near the cabin with bright tape so that if I had to leave in a hurry, I would have a clear path. By the second night, I had learned to stay calm. I kept a fire burning, maintained a flashlight in hand, and listened closely but without panic. The sounds of the forest were normal now. Owls, rustling leaves, distant animals. I understood that fear had a way of magnifying everything, making shadows seem alive and the ordinary seem threatening. I slept in short bursts, waking at every small noise, but by morning, I felt more in control. The final day, I packed my belongings carefully, leaving the cabin as I had found it. The forest looked less menacing in daylight. The roads back were long but uneventful. I reflected on the experience, understanding that the fear I had felt was real, but the danger was mostly in my perception, magnified by isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. I had survived, and I had learned something crucial. Fear is most dangerous when it isolates you from reason and observation. I left the cabin with a mix of relief and triumph. The forest receded behind me, and I knew I would never underestimate the psychological weight of isolation again. The experience had been terrifying, exhausting, and intensely vivid, but it was real, grounded in the natural world, and I had emerged unscathed. I returned home with a story that, while frightening, had a clear ending. I had faced fear in its rawest form, and I had survived through vigilance, preparation, and careful observation. I had been planning the trip for months, though I didn't admit to anyone how much it was about escaping. I needed the silence, the isolation, the kind of solitude you can't find in the city or even in small towns. The cabin was tucked deep into the northern woods, miles away from the nearest highway. The map I had found online made it look simple, a straight drive followed by a few trails that led into the trees. But as I would soon learn, maps never show the full story. I left the city early in the morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the skyline. The roads were quiet, the air crisp and cold. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as I passed the last sign of civilization. A small gas station with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that read, "No services beyond this point." After that, it was just me, the forest, and the narrow dirt road that twisted and turned like it belonged to a different world. The further I drove, the quieter everything became. Even the wind seemed to vanish, leaving only the faint crunch of tires against gravel. The cabin itself was hidden in a small clearing, almost swallowed by the forest. From the road, it looked like a tiny wooden box, dark and sturdy, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking in the smell of wet pine and damp earth. The air was different out here, sharper, cleaner, heavier with the scent of leaves and moss. I had brought all the supplies I thought I might need. Food for 3 days, bottled water, a first aid kit, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, and a small toolbox. I always over-prepared, but that felt right for this trip. The cabin's door was surprisingly heavy, made of thick wood with an old brass handle that had dulled over time. Inside, the air was musty, smelling faintly of smoke and wood polish. The main room had a small stone fireplace, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bunk bed pushed against the far wall. The floor creaked under my weight as I walked through, echoing in the quiet that seemed unnatural in the middle of a forest. I set down my bags and opened the windows to let in the air. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I spent the morning unpacking and setting things in order, making the place feel like a temporary home. I checked the fireplace, stacking logs and kindling, making sure everything was ready in case I needed warmth during the night. I explored the perimeter of the cabin, noting how isolated it truly was. There were no other cabins in sight, no signs of nearby trails used regularly, just the thick forest that seemed to go on forever. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension in the air I couldn't shake. A part of me, a small rational voice I ignored, whispered that being so isolated always carried a risk. By afternoon, I had settled into a rhythm. I made a simple meal on the small gas stove, listening to the occasional crack of branches outside. The wind picked up, moving the trees with low, groaning creaks, and for a moment, I felt the weight of being completely alone. There was a beauty in it, but also a hint of danger. I reminded myself I was prepared, that this was just a short retreat. After eating, I cleaned up and started organizing the supplies again. Everything had a place. It made me feel in control. Evening came quickly. The forest darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only a dim twilight between the trunks. I built a fire in the fireplace, the flames flickering and casting moving shadows on the walls. The warmth was comforting, but the silence outside had grown heavy, almost physical. I sat near the fire, watching it burn, listening to the occasional crack of a distant branch, a sound that made my skin prick. Every snap of wood made my heart jump. I knew the forest held life. Deer, raccoons, owls, but in the dark, those creatures felt larger, more imposing. Around 10, I decided to check the windows. I moved slowly, each step deliberate, listening. That's when I first noticed it. A faint sound, almost like footsteps, coming from the back of the cabin. It was subtle, hesitant, and easily explained by a deer or some small animal. I froze, listening, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But the tension had settled deep in my chest, a constant reminder that being alone in the forest carried an unspoken risk. I went to bed, laying in the bottom bunk with a blanket pulled tightly around me. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers, but I didn't mind. Sleep came slowly. Every small sound, the wind brushing against the walls, the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, kept me alert. I couldn't ignore how different the night felt, how vast and quiet the world had become. It was around 2 in the morning that the noises returned, this time closer and sharper. Footsteps, not the cautious, irregular steps of a deer, but deliberate, measured, human-like steps circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening as they stopped near the back door. My hands shook slightly as I reached for the small flashlight I had left on the nightstand. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the wooden walls and the faint outlines of the windows. The steps moved again, slower this time, circling the cabin in a way that no animal would. I stayed still, trying to calm my racing heart. The rational part of me refused to acknowledge the thought that had crossed my mind. Someone was outside, and they knew I was here. Panic settled in, heavy and suffocating. I thought about locking the doors, but the old lock was flimsy and the hinges rusty. I considered grabbing my car keys and making a run for it, but the nearest road was miles away, and there was no guarantee I could make it in the dark through the forest. I decided to wait, holding the flashlight like a weapon, my body pressed against the wall. The footsteps stopped again, closer this time, and I could hear the faint scrape of something against wood. A shadow passed across the window, quick and deliberate. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white, and shined it toward the window, but the figure was gone. It was then I realized the cabin's back door, which I had double-checked before bed, had a small scratch mark along the bottom. Someone had tried the handle. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every sound amplified in my mind. I thought about the worst-case scenarios. A lost hiker, a criminal hiding in the woods, someone with intent. The night stretched endlessly, each hour marked by my shallow breathing and the occasional distant sound of movement outside. When morning finally arrived, the sun barely lifting over the trees, I didn't sleep. I only waited until I had enough light to see clearly. As soon as the light allowed, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were footprints, fresh and unmistakable, circling the clearing. They were human, not animal, and they ended abruptly at the treeline. I didn't wait to investigate further. I grabbed my things, loaded the car, and left the clearing as fast as I could, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the first main road, and even then, I felt the forest's presence like a weight at my back. The days after were tense. I called the local ranger station to report the incident. They told me they had received similar reports in the area, some hikers noticing signs that someone had been watching from a distance, but no one had ever been caught. The area was remote, difficult to monitor, and prone to people taking advantage of its isolation. I realized that what I had thought would be a peaceful retreat had almost become dangerous because I had underestimated how isolated the cabin truly was. In the weeks that followed, I replayed everything in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened. I couldn't know who had been outside, whether it was a hiker lost in the woods or someone with malicious intent. I never went back. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that isolation has its own dangers and that being prepared isn't just about supplies. It's about understanding the environment and respecting its risks. Months later, I drove through a different forested area, far from the cabin, and felt a strange sense of relief. I had survived the night, had escaped without confrontation, and had learned a hard lesson about solitude and vigilance. I still think about the cabin sometimes, about the dark night and the footsteps, but now the memory carries a strange clarity. I had been cautious, observant, and ultimately, I had trusted my instincts enough to leave when it mattered most. I never told anyone the full story, because it sounds too strange to be believable, but the lesson was clear. The forest may look peaceful, the cabin cozy, and the world silent, but danger doesn't need to make a noise, and it doesn't need an explanation. It simply exists, waiting for the right moment. And I had learned, the hard way, how quickly a peaceful retreat can turn into a nightmare when you are alone. Since then, I plan my trips differently. I make sure someone knows where I am, I check my surroundings constantly, and I understand that isolation isn't always a gift. It can be a risk. The memory of that night at the cabin is etched into my mind. Every creak of the floor, every shadow, every step outside that wasn't mine. It taught me respect for the unknown, for the unseen, and for the fact that being prepared sometimes means more than packing the right gear. It means being aware of the people you might not see until it's too late. I had always loved escaping to the woods. The quiet, the smell of pine, the way the air changed as soon as you stepped off the road. It was like stepping into a different world. That year, I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the forest, far away from any towns, roads, or even cell service. The place was advertised as isolated but safe, a perfect spot to disconnect for a week. I didn't realize how seriously isolated it actually was until I arrived. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age. A small porch ran along the front, with 2 wooden chairs that were worn and slightly uneven. The roof was metal, dented in some places, and I could hear the faint echo of wind against it as I unpacked my things. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, but it was clean. The furniture was basic: a small table, 2 chairs, a bed, a tiny wood stove, and shelves filled with old books and a few board games. There was a stack of firewood in the corner, neatly cut and dry. I felt a strange sense of comfort in its simplicity. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked, explored the surrounding area, and collected some dry branches for the stove. I kept noticing how still everything felt. The trees pressed close around the cabin, the canopy so thick in places that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. Birds moved quietly overhead, and a few squirrels darted between trunks. No other people, no distant cars, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The night came quickly. I built a fire in the stove, listening to the logs crack and hiss. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it pushing through the pines, causing the branches to scrape against each other and against the side of the cabin. It was a natural sound, but the way it seemed to echo through the forest made it feel close, somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was surrounded, that the trees were closing in. I slept lightly that night. Every small sound startled me. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the wind's occasional howl. I kept imagining someone or something moving outside, walking between the trees, but the logical part of my mind kept reminding me that there was nothing out there. No one could get here without a long hike, and the nearest road was miles away. Still, I couldn't completely relax. The following morning, I set out to explore further. I wanted to get familiar with the area, mark landmarks, and maybe find a stream or small lake. The forest was dense, and every step was over roots, fallen branches, or soft moss. I walked carefully, aware of how quickly I could lose my way. The silence of the woods was heavier than I expected. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. By late afternoon, I had wandered several miles from the cabin. I found a small clearing with a shallow stream trickling through. The water was cold and clear, and I knelt to drink and splash some on my face. I stayed long enough to take notes on the landscape, sketch some rough maps, and mark the direction back to the cabin using natural markers like tree shapes and the slope of the land. On the way back, I thought about how I could get lost if I wasn't careful. A wrong turn could easily leave me wandering until dark. That night, I was more alert, I slept with the door slightly open, the fire burning low, listening to the wind and the creaking of the cabin. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a branch snapping close to the cabin. My heart jumped. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe an animal. But the sound was different, deliberate in a way the wind isn't. Another snap, and I could hear something moving quickly through the underbrush. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the pattern of movement didn't fit. It was too heavy, too fast. I stayed still, trying to see or hear more. I didn't see anything. By morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal. The forest was full of them. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I hiked during the day, returned to the cabin, made fires, and tried to keep my mind occupied with reading and drawing. But the feeling of being watched never fully went away. Sometimes I thought I saw glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows that didn't make sense. Other times, I'd hear footsteps far away, slow and deliberate, that stopped whenever I paused. On the fourth day, I decided to make a more thorough check of the cabin's perimeter. I walked around the entire structure, inspecting for damage, weak spots, anything that could allow an animal or a person to get inside. Everything seemed fine. I was alone. The area was isolated. And yet, I found fresh footprints in the soft dirt near the back of the cabin. They were too large for any animal I knew. Human. Someone had walked around the cabin in the night. Panic rose in my chest. I had no neighbors for miles. The nearest ranger station was at least 10 miles away. My phone had no signal. The only way out was to hike back along the trail I had marked. But that would take hours. And if someone was nearby, I had no idea whether they were dangerous. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin. I stacked firewood against the back door, checked the windows, and made sure I could lock the door securely. I placed heavier branches across the front porch as makeshift obstacles. Every noise outside made me tense, my mind filling in the gaps with worst-case scenarios. The night after I found the footprints was the worst. I heard voices, soft murmurs carried by the wind. They weren't words I could make out, just human tones. I didn't move. I sat behind the stove, flashlight in hand, listening. Footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving away. At one point, I thought I saw shadows through the window, but I couldn't be sure. Hours passed like this. I barely slept. The next morning, I made a plan. I would leave the cabin and hike back to the main road. I couldn't risk staying. I packed quickly, making sure I had water, food, and a basic first aid kit. I traced the path I had mapped earlier, keeping my eyes on the forest ahead and behind. The hike was grueling. The terrain was rough, with roots and rocks, mud, and uneven ground. My pack was heavy, my legs ached, and I kept imagining someone following me. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me stop and look. I stayed on the path I had marked, avoiding shortcuts. Hours later, I reached the top of a ridge and could see the road in the distance. Relief washed over me. I broke into a run, stumbling but determined. I crossed the last stretch of forest and finally reached the road. A car passed by and I waved frantically. The driver slowed, stopped, and offered me a ride. I didn't even have to explain much. I got into the car, shaking, exhausted, and kept looking back at the trees that had felt so alive and threatening for the past few days. The cabin was abandoned behind me, but I left knowing I would never return. The forest was beautiful, peaceful in the daylight, but when you are alone, it could feel like it was watching. That experience changed how I viewed solitude. Being alone in nature isn't just about quiet and beauty. It can bring fear in its rawest, most human form. That week at the cabin taught me the value of preparation, awareness, and knowing your limits. And while the experience was terrifying, I made it out safely because I stayed calm, observed everything carefully, and made deliberate choices. Even now, months later, I still think about the footprints, the shadows, the noises. I never saw who or what was circling the cabin that night, but I know they were human, real, close enough to be dangerous. And I know that staying alert, being careful, and leaving when I had the chance is what saved me.